3 days after I watched groundskeepers shovel frozen dirt over my husband's casket, my phone vibrated against the marble kitchen counter. The caller identified himself as Silas Thorne, the landlord of a commercial property Elias supposedly rented. My husband never mentioned a secondary lease. I gripped the edge of the counter as the stranger's gravelly voice bled through the speaker. "Reagan," he rasped, urgency clipping his vowels. "I found something you need to see. Get down here immediately." I opened my mouth to request details, but he cut me off, his tone dropping to a lethal whisper. "Do not tell your sister. Do not tell her fiancé. You have to see this alone." The line snapped dead, leaving me standing in a silent kitchen, staring at a blank screen. My sister, Daphne, and her fiancé, Roland, were currently occupying my living room, drinking my premium scotch, and shedding calculated crocodile tears over my husband's tragic accident. I grabbed my keys, slipped out the back door, and drove to the address Silas provided. I pushed open the heavy steel door of the warehouse, expecting to find a hidden box of documents. Instead, the sight waiting for me in the shadows forced the breath completely out of my lungs. Before I explain exactly what was waiting behind that heavy steel door, let me know in the comments where you are watching from today. Be sure to like and subscribe if you believe toxic family members always get the devastating karma they deserve. I need to reverse time slightly to put the pieces together, exactly 3 hours before Silas Thorne called my cell phone. I stood in a desolate cemetery on the industrial outskirts of the city. The temperature hovered near freezing. The winter wind whipped bare branches against the stone monuments, creating a sharp, rhythmic cracking sound. I stared straight ahead, my eyes locked on the polished mahogany box resting above a rectangular hole. Inside that box lay Elias. He was 40 years old. A police investigator visited my home just 72 hours earlier, holding a clipboard and wearing a practiced expression of sympathy. He classified the event as a tragic vehicular accident. He claimed Elias suffered a catastrophic tire blowout on a steep coastal embankment. The vehicle plunged over the edge, rolling multiple times before igniting at the bottom of the ravine. The investigator handed me a charred wedding band inside a plastic evidence bag, closed his file, and drove away. As an actuary specializing in high-level risk assessment for a global reinsurance firm, my brain processes trauma through probabilities and data sets. I calculate risk for a living. I evaluate mortality tables, structural failures, and statistical anomalies. A blown tire on a properly maintained luxury sedan, driven by a meticulously cautious man, did not fit the standard deviation. The mathematics felt wrong. The variables refused to align. Yet, as the cemetery machinery engaged the mechanical winch to lower Elias into the frost-hardened earth, my logic faltered. The visual reality of the descending casket shattered my numerical defenses. Daphne stood to my immediate right. She dug her manicured fingernails into my forearm, leaning her weight against me in a theatrical display of grief. My younger sister possessed a lifelong talent for centering herself in every available spotlight. She wore a custom black designer coat, her face concealed behind oversized sunglasses. She dabbed at dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, ensuring every attendee noticed her profound mourning. Standing directly behind her was Roland, her fiancé, a wealth manager by trade. Roland exuded a cloying, predatory confidence. He gripped my opposite shoulder, his fingers pressing into my collarbone with unnecessary force. He leaned close to my ear, his breath smelling of expensive coffee and peppermint. He whispered hollow, rehearsed platitudes about leaning on family during impossible times. I endured his touch, keeping my posture rigid. I knew Daphne harbored decades of festering resentment toward me. I knew Roland viewed my existence merely as a hurdle, blocking his access to our grandfather Thaddeus's $12 million estate. Thaddeus passed away 4 months ago from sudden heart failure. The trust stipulations dictated that upon my 39th birthday, now less than 14 days away, I would inherit 80% of the fund. Daphne and Roland required my cooperation, or my incapacitation, to access that capital. Following the burial, the remaining mourners dispersed rapidly, escaping the biting wind. Daphne and Roland insisted on escorting me back to my house. They marched through my front doors, shed their heavy coats, and immediately occupied the space. Roland poured himself a generous measure of Elias's vintage scotch. Swirling the amber liquid in the crystal tumbler, Daphne began rearranging the sympathy bouquets on the dining table, openly criticizing the floral arrangement sent by Elias's colleagues. I sat on the edge of the sofa, staring at the oak floorboards. The house felt cavernous. The silence pressed heavily against my eardrums. I retreated to the kitchen under the guise of brewing tea, desperate to escape Roland's suffocating presence. I braced my hands against the marble counter, fighting a rising, violent urge to shatter the ceramic mugs against the tile floor. That was the precise moment the phone vibrated in my pocket, leading to the call from Silas Thorne. Silas spoke with rapid, clipped precision. He demanded I drive to the property immediately. He specifically instructed me to leave Daphne and Roland behind. The explicit warning to exclude my sister and her fiancé severed the fog of grief clouding my mind. A stranger possessed intimate knowledge of my immediate surroundings. A stranger knew the exact individuals currently occupying my living room. I terminated the call. I slipped my phone into my pocket, grabbed my car keys from the hook by the back door, and retrieved a canister of pepper spray from the utility drawer. I walked quietly down the hallway, bypassing the living room entirely. I heard Roland's voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling, casually discussing the potential real estate value of my home. Daphne laughed, a short, sharp sound completely devoid of sorrow. I exited through the garage, sliding behind the wheel of my car. I pressed the ignition button, leaving the headlights off until I cleared the driveway, and accelerated down the street. The drive to the address Silas provided took exactly 45 minutes. The weather deteriorated rapidly. A torrential downpour washed over the city, slicking the asphalt and reducing visibility to mere feet. The windshield wipers beat a frantic rhythm, clearing the heavy sheets of water only for a fraction of a second before the glass flooded again. The skyline faded in the rearview mirror, replaced by the decaying infrastructure of the industrial district. Abandoned factories loomed in the darkness, their shattered windows resembling hollow, watchful eyes. I navigated the flooded streets, my mind racing through algorithmic possibilities. If Elias leased a secret property, he was hiding data. If he was hiding data, he uncovered a risk factor he could not bring into our home. If Silas Thorne knew Daphne and Roland posed a threat, then the vehicular accident was not a statistical anomaly. It was a targeted execution. I pulled into the cracked concrete parking lot of a dilapidated textile warehouse. The structure sat entirely isolated, bordered by a chain-link fence topped with rusted razor wire. No streetlights illuminated the perimeter. A single, dull yellow bulb flickered above a heavy steel entry door. I parked the car, killed the engine, and gripped the steering wheel. The rain hammered against the roof, deafening and relentless. I stepped out into the storm. The freezing water instantly soaked through my dark wool coat, chilling my skin. I ignored the physical discomfort. I marched across the cracked pavement, closing my hand tightly around the pepper spray canister hidden inside my pocket. I reached the entryway and grasped the rusted iron handle. The heavy steel door groaned in protest as I pulled it open, stepping out of the torrential rain and into the dry, stagnant air of the warehouse. Vast shadows swallowed the interior. High, vaulted ceilings disappeared into the darkness above. A single desk lamp cast a tight, concentrated pool of light in the center of the concrete floor. I clicked the safety off the pepper spray, my thumb hovering over the actuator. I stepped forward, my wet boots squeaking against the polished concrete. I braced myself to confront Silas Thorne. I prepared my mind to view stolen documents, hidden financial ledgers, or blackmail materials. I locked my emotions into a secure mental vault, ready to analyze the evidence of my husband's murder. I walked toward the edge of the light. A figure detached itself from the deep shadows near the back wall. The man stepped into the illumination of the desk lamp. He did not hold a weapon. He did not hold a file. He simply stood there, wearing a dark sweater and jeans, watching me approach. The pepper spray slipped from my fingers, clattering loudly against the concrete floor. The complex actuarial equations constructing my reality completely shattered. The man standing in front of me, breathing steadily in the dim light, was the exact same man I had buried in the frozen earth 3 hours ago. My lungs seized. Oxygen stopped flowing. 1, 2, 3. The paralysis broke. Elias stepped further into the tight circle of illumination cast by the desk lamp. I scanned him from head to toe. No charred flesh marked his skin. No casts encased his limbs. His posture remained perfectly aligned, his breathing steady, his eyes focused and sharp. He stood entirely whole, breathing the damp, metallic air of the warehouse. I did not collapse onto the cracked concrete. I did not expel a hysterical scream. Decades of rigorous actuarial conditioning training built on stripping emotion from catastrophic data overrode the trauma, engaging a cold, mechanical logic. A hallucination does not displace physical space. A phantom does not cast a solid shadow against a brick wall. I crossed the floor, planted my boots firmly against the concrete, and swung my right arm. My palm struck his jaw with a sharp, echoing crack. His head snapped to the side from the kinetic force. A red welt instantly blossomed across his left cheekbone. Physical contact verified reality. He was tangible. I grabbed the lapels of his wool sweater, twisting the thick fabric into my fists, and yanked him forward. I buried my face against the crook of his neck, inhaling the sharp, unmistakable scent of cedar and rain, pulling him into a bone-crushing embrace. He wrapped his arms around my shoulders, his chest heaving against mine. I gripped him until my knuckles ached, anchoring my entire existence to his living, breathing form. I pushed back, keeping one hand locked onto his forearm. "Explain," I commanded. My voice held zero tremor. It was the tone I used when dismantling fraudulent corporate claims. Clinical variables, step by step, now. Behind us. Silas Thorne stepped out of the periphery. The older man moved with the silent efficiency of a retired investigator. He threw the heavy deadbolt on the steel door. The metal lock engaged with a definitive, echoing thud. Silas checked the window blinds, ensuring complete blackout, before crossing his arms and guarding the perimeter. Elias guided me toward a battered metal table positioned beneath the lamp. We stood on opposite sides. He began detailing the mechanics of his supposed demise. "The tire blowout on the coastal embankment was orchestrated," Elias stated, keeping his tone flat and objective. "I discovered the tampering hours before my scheduled drive. Roland bypassed our security. He hired off-the-books mechanics to shave the inner lining of the front passenger tire and compromise the steering column linkage." My brain rapidly cataloged the data points. A compromised steering column combined with a sudden blowout at high velocity guaranteed a plunge into the ravine. The crash parameters were engineered for maximum fatality. "I knew they planned to execute the maneuver on my route home," Elias continued. "I contacted Silas. We had exactly 4 hours to construct a counter-narrative. Silas intercepted a John Doe, an unclaimed, transient cadaver from the county morgue scheduled for mass cremation. He utilized his former private investigation contacts to bypass the transit logs and secure the body." Elias placed his hands flat on the metal table, his gaze unyielding. "We dressed the cadaver in my suit. I secured the body in the driver's seat. We positioned the sedan at the top of the embankment, rigged the accelerator with a mechanical wedge, and sent the vehicle over the edge. It rolled, ruptured the fuel line, and ignited exactly as Roland's people calculated. The fire burned at over 1,000 degrees. I tracked the sequence, analyzing the forensic loopholes. The coroner required dental records to confirm identity. Fire destroys fingerprints and DNA degrades, but teeth survive. "Before the fire consumed the cabin, Silas and I executed a digital breach," Elias explained. "We hacked into the centralized state dental registry. We swapped my panoramic x-rays with the John Doe's records. When the coroner extracted the charred jawbone and cross-referenced the database, the system verified my identity without throwing a single error code." My mind assimilated the timeline. "You executed a staging operation," I said, mapping the variables. "You fabricated an assassination." "I survived an assassination," Elias corrected, his voice dropping an octave, "and I allowed them to believe they succeeded." "Why," the question snapped through the damp air, Why subject me to that funeral? Why force me to bury a stranger in the frozen earth while Roland paraded through my home? Elias stepped around the table, closing the distance between us. He reached out, gripping my shoulders, his thumbs pressed into my collarbones. Because your grief provided the ultimate camouflage, Elias said. Roland placed you under continuous, microscopic observation. He monitored your heart rate via your smartwatch data. He analyzed your micro-expressions at the graveside. He watched you receive the coroner's notification. If I had informed you, if you harbored a single fraction of relief, Roland would have recognized the deception immediately. He leaned closer. Weeping over that casket kept you breathing. Reagan, your absolute unfiltered devastation convinced them the threat was neutralized. The performance had to be flawless, which meant the pain had to be real. I absorbed the reality of his words. Daphne's manicured nails digging into my arm at the cemetery, Roland whispering in my ear, gripping my shoulder. They were not offering condolences. They were celebrating, I stated, the puzzle pieces snapping together with lethal precision. Roland and Daphne were not mourning, Elias confirmed, his expression hardening into stone. They executed a successful liquidation of a perceived obstacle. I dug too deep into their offshore routing accounts. I found the anomalies in Thaddeus's estate transfers. I became a liability, so they removed me. Elias released my shoulders and turned toward the desk. He pulled a thick manila folder from the shadows and tossed it onto the metal surface. They eliminated me to isolate you, Elias said. Thaddeus left $12 million in that trust. You inherit 80% of that capital on your 39th birthday. That event occurs in less than 2 weeks. You are the final firewall standing between Roland and the money he desperately requires to cover his collapsing investments. I stared at the folder. Outside, the freezing rain battered the corrugated steel roof, a chaotic drumbeat against the silence of the warehouse. They do not plan to share the estate. Reagan, Elias stated, delivering the final, chilling variable. They intend to ensure you suffer a tragic, fatal accident before you reach your 39th birthday. The equation resolved perfectly. My sister and her fiancé conspired to murder my husband. They danced on his grave, occupied my home, drank his scotch, and actively plotted to end my life to secure a fortune. The residual fog of my mourning evaporated, incinerated by a sudden, consuming clarity. I did not feel fear. I did not feel the sting of betrayal. The familial bonds tethering me to Daphne disintegrated into ash. I unbuttoned my wet wool coat, draped it over the back of a folding chair, and pulled the manila folder toward me. Show me the data, I ordered. Elias opened the manila folder, breaking the seal on a reality I had completely misunderstood. He extracted a dense stack of printed spreadsheets, fanning the heavy paper across the battered metal table. I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto the cascading columns of routing numbers, international SWIFT codes, and transaction timestamps as a risk assessor. My brain natively translates numerical data into behavioral narratives. The numbers presented an immediate, glaring anomaly. Analyze the capital flow, Elias instructed, tapping a heavily redacted ledger with his index finger. Thaddeus maintained conservative portfolios. He favored low yield, high stability. He avoided volatile markets. I traced the numeric progression. The data confirmed his assessment. My grandfather's financial architecture prioritized preservation over aggressive growth. However, precisely 4 months ago, the algorithm fractured. Massive liquidity hemorrhages, I noted, tracking a sequence of unauthorized wire transfers. Millions vanished from the primary holding accounts in a matter of days. Elias nodded, sliding a secondary document over the ledger. Roland bypassed the standard probate protocols. He initiated these transfers weeks prior to Thaddeus's death, funneling the capital into offshore shell companies housed in jurisdictions with opaque banking laws. He drained the accessible liquidity to mask the theft. The timeline bothered me. Thaddeus died 4 months ago. The coroner certified the cause of death as natural heart failure. A man in his late 70s passing away in his sleep barely registers as a statistical deviation. It closes the file. Thaddeus died of a myocardial infarction, I stated, scanning the dates. If Roland drained the accounts weeks prior, he risked Thaddeus noticing the deficit and initiating a federal audit. Thaddeus did not suffer a random biological failure, Elias countered, his voice dropping into a register devoid of emotion. He pulled a separate, specialized file from the stack, a series of medical device telemetry logs. Roland did not merely steal the money, he controlled the timeline. Elias pushed the decrypted telemetry log toward me. Thaddeus utilized a wireless cardiac pacemaker. Modern units possess remote monitoring capabilities, designed to upload diagnostic data to a cardiologist via radio frequency transmitters. I stared at the raw code spanning the page. A sequence of unauthorized access protocols marched across the digital log. Roland contracted a black market technician, Elias explained, pointing to the external intrusion metrics. They intercepted the radio frequency telemetry of the pacemaker. They bypassed the device's firewall and flooded the processor with override commands. I translated the hexadecimal code, my actuarial training snapping the horrifying reality into focus. The hacker disabled the safety limits. They instructed the pacemaker to deliver sustained, high-voltage shocks directly to my grandfather's ventricular tissue. They intentionally triggered ventricular fibrillation. They induced a catastrophic cardiac event, I murmured, tracing the final line of code that marked the exact moment Thaddeus's heart stopped. A digital execution, Elias confirmed. It leaves zero physical trauma, no chemical traces in the bloodstream, no bruising to a county coroner. It mimics a natural heart attack perfectly. I stared at the telemetry data, the numbers solidifying into an undeniable, monstrous truth. My grandfather was assassinated via a Bluetooth override. A memory from 4 months ago surged into my mind. I pictured Daphne standing at the polished mahogany lectern during Thaddeus's funeral. She wore a tailored black dress. Dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief, she delivered a tearful, trembling eulogy, speaking of his gentle soul and the tragic suddenness of his passing. She wept for the congregation, projecting the image of a devastated granddaughter. She stood at that altar, crying over a wooden casket. Fully aware she had authorized his digital execution, she watched him die, and then she accepted the condolences of his friends. The last remaining threads of my familial loyalty disintegrated into ash. A predatory crystalline focus calcified in my chest, sealing away the sister I thought I knew. Daphne was no longer family. She was a hostile entity. She was a liability requiring permanent neutralization. I did not feel sorrow. I felt an overwhelming surge of lethal clarity. "When did Roland realize you located the audit trail?" I asked, my voice completely stripped of inflection. Elias leaned his weight against the metal table. "1 week ago. I breached his primary offshore holding account. I extracted the routing numbers, but I tripped a silent security protocol embedded in his network. He mapped the intrusion back to my terminal." Silas stepped out from the shadows near the reinforced door, crossing his arms. "Roland panicked," the older man stated. "He prefers quiet methods, like the pacemaker, but Elias forced his hand. He ordered my vehicle run off the embankment 3 days later," Elias added. "He hired the mechanics to compromise the steering linkage and shave the tire lining. I survived the crash by a matter of inches." I processed the timeline. Roland discovered the breach 1 week ago. He executed the vehicular assassination 3 days ago. He moved with desperate, sloppy aggression. Men like Roland only abandon their preferred, untraceable methods when a deadline approaches, threatening their survival. Elias tapped a thick, legal document resting at the bottom of the manila folder. "You are the final obstacle, Reagan." Thaddeus structured the trust securely. He locked the majority of the capital behind an age-gated stipulation. I knew the terms. I memorized the document years ago. Upon my 39th birthday, the estate automatically disperses 80% of the $12 million directly into my primary accounts. "Exactly," Elias said. "Roland cannot access that capital. Daphne cannot access it. The moment you turn 39, the funds transfer into an ironclad trust under your exclusive control. Roland leveraged his illicit offshore ventures with massive debt. He requires that $12 million to cover his margins." I calculated the dates, referencing my mental calendar. My 39th birthday occurs in exactly 14 days. 14 days, Elias echoed. If Roland fails to secure your portion of the trust, his creditors will dismantle him. The offshore entities he borrows from do not utilize lawyers. They utilize hitmen. He is trapped. I looked at the forged death certificate resting on the table, then back to my husband. He requires my signature on a comprehensive power of attorney to redirect the funds before the transfer initiates. Or, Silas interjected, his voice grim, he requires you to suffer a fatal accident before the 14 days expire, transferring the estate to your next of kin, Daphne. The parameters of the battlefield were set. I was not merely a grieving widow. I was the primary target holding a $12 million bounty on my head. Roland and Daphne occupied my house, pouring my scotch, pretending to mourn, while actively calculating the most efficient method to stop my heart before my 39th birthday. I gathered the telemetry logs, the offshore routing numbers, and the forensic crash reports. I aligned the edges of the paper, returning them to the manila folder. I slid the folder across the metal table to Elias. "Keep the data secure," I ordered, turning toward the heavy steel door. "Where are you going?" Elias asked, stepping forward. "I am returning to my house," I replied, pulling my wet wool coat over my shoulders. Roland and Daphne believe they are surveilling a shattered, helpless widow. If I disappear tonight, they will scatter, and they will destroy the evidence. I have to go back. I have to let them watch me break. I left the abandoned textile warehouse behind, navigating the flooded industrial streets as the storm raged against my windshield. Silas Thorne had provided me with an address for a discreet, 24-hour tactical supply depot located on the perimeter of the city. I bypassed the main interstate, sticking to the desolate service roads to ensure my route remained untraceable. I pulled my sedan into the cracked asphalt lot of the supply depot. Fluorescent tubes hummed overhead, casting a harsh, flickering glare over the aisles of surplus gear. I approached the counter, bypassed the idle clerk, and located exactly what my new reality demanded. I placed $300 in cash on the scratch glass display case, purchasing a military-grade radio frequency scanner and a handheld infrared lens detector. I pocketed the devices, returned to my vehicle, and drove back toward the affluent, quiet suburb I called home. The dashboard clock glowed, reading exactly midnight when I killed the engine in my driveway. The storm had reduced to a steady, freezing drizzle. I sat behind the steering wheel, staring at the darkened facade of my house. Roland and Daphne had departed hours ago, leaving the property empty. But the structure no longer belonged to me. It represented a compromised grid. It was a hostile environment. Before opening the car door, I prepared my physical mask. A successful risk assessor understands that humans ignore data that contradicts their established biases. Roland and Daphne expected to see a shattered, helpless widow. I intended to deliver a flawless performance. I rubbed my knuckles into my eyes, grinding the grit and rainwater into my lashes, intentionally smearing my waterproof mascara down my cheeks. I unfastened my coat, leaving it hanging loose off my shoulders. I slumped my spine, collapsing my posture to mimic absolute physiological defeat. I dragged my boots against the wet driveway, shuffling toward the front porch. I inserted my key into the deadbolt, turned the cylinder, and pushed the heavy oak door open. The immediate atmosphere of the house struck me like a physical blow. The ambient temperature felt stagnant. The lingering scent of Roland's expensive peppermint cologne contaminated the hallway, overriding the familiar smell of cedar that usually accompanied Elias. I closed the door, sliding the deadbolt into place with a hollow click. I bypassed the foyer light switches. I refused to illuminate the primary circuits. Street lamps outside cast elongated, distorted shadows through the plantation shutters, slicing across the hardwood floors. I retrieved the radio frequency scanner from my coat pocket. I engaged the silent haptic mode, ensuring the device communicated solely through physical vibrations against my palm, emitting zero acoustic signals. I commenced the sweep. I moved with the slow, erratic steps of a woman sedated by trauma, masking my methodical search beneath a facade of aimless wandering. I drifted into the living room, trailing my hand along the edge of the sofa. The scanner remained dormant until I approached the fireplace. As I stepped onto the hearth, the device hummed, delivering a rapid, sustained vibration against my skin. I dropped to my knees, exhaling a ragged sigh to cover any rustling fabric. I traced the signal source. My fingers slid behind the carved mahogany mantelpiece. I brushed against a small, rectangular object adhered to the wood, a matte black acoustic transmitter. Roland had positioned it perfectly to capture any conversations originating from the seating area. I left the transmitter untouched. Disabling the bug would instantly alert Roland to my awareness. I cataloged its location and rose to my feet, dragging my boots across the threshold into the formal dining room. I circled the heavy oak dining table. The scanner pulsed again, the haptic feedback intensifying as I neared the center of the room. I dropped my keys intentionally, letting them clatter against the floorboards. I crouched to retrieve them, running my free hand along the underside of the table. My knuckles grazed a secondary transmitter, anchored directly beside the central support beam. Two distinct audio bugs. Roland prioritized acoustic coverage in the primary gathering spaces, preparing to record every word I uttered in my supposed isolation. I gripped the scanner, transitioning toward the kitchen. The kitchen served as the central nervous system of the house, featuring open sightlines to the living room and the rear patio. I stepped onto the cold tile. Instantly, the scanner buzzed furiously against my palm, signaling a massive transmission spike. I paused, breathing shallowly. An acoustic bug emits a low-level frequency. The violent vibration radiating through the scanner indicated a data stream requiring significantly more bandwidth. I slipped the frequency scanner into my pocket and extracted the infrared lens detector. I shielded the device with my torso, engaging the laser array, and swept the ceiling. A microscopic pinpoint of red light reflected back at me, glowing fiercely from the smoke detector positioned directly above the granite kitchen island. My heart locked into a slow, measured rhythm. Roland did not merely install audio surveillance, he embedded a microscopic, wide-angle lens into the smoke detector. He demanded visual confirmation of my despair. He wanted to watch me break. I deactivated the infrared detector and slid it into my pocket. I knew the exact parameters of the lens. I understood its focal length, its field of view, and its blind spots. I walked directly into the center of the kitchen, positioning myself squarely beneath the smoke detector's unblinking gaze. I collapsed onto the kitchen stool, letting my wet wool coat slide off my shoulders and pool onto the floor. I dropped my head forward, burying my face deeply into my hands. I weaponized my physiological responses. I forced my shoulders to heave, drawing jagged, ragged breaths into my lungs. I expelled choked, guttural sobs that echoed off the granite countertops and tile backsplash. The tears that flowed down my cheeks were entirely genuine, fueled not by sorrow, but by a cold, consuming rage. I wept for the grandfather they murdered. I wept for the husband they hunted. I wept for the sister who betrayed me. I let the tears fall, shaking violently on the stool, delivering the exact performance Roland required. I projected total, irreversible devastation. Internally, while my shoulders shook and my voice cracked, my actuarial mind operated with terrifying efficiency. Behind my hands, my eyes remained completely dry and fixed on the floor tiles. I mentally mapped a three-dimensional grid of my own kitchen. I charted the camera's unalterable trajectory. I calculated the angles. A 45-degree dead zone existed directly adjacent to the walk-in pantry. A secondary blind spot lay concealed beyond the refrigerator alcove, shielded by the overhanging cabinetry. I registered the exact acoustic range of the transmitters in the living room and dining room, determining the precise decibel threshold I could utilize without triggering the microphones. I computed the vectors required to traverse my home completely undetected. I established safe zones, secure communication coordinates, and logistical supply lines within the structure. Roland and Daphne believed they controlled the environment. They believed they were surveilling a helpless, shattered widow waiting quietly for slaughter. I sobbed louder, dragging my nails against my scalp, pulling at my damp hair. I fed their arrogance. I gave them a masterpiece of vulnerability. They sat in their own homes, monitoring the live feed, celebrating their perceived dominance. They had absolutely no idea they were actively documenting the genesis of their own impending destruction. I would let them watch me break tonight, because tomorrow, I was going to systematically dismantle their entire world. The chime of the doorbell shattered the morning silence. I had not slept. I spent the entire night sitting on the cold hardwood floor tucked inside the 45-degree blind spot near the pantry, maintaining complete visual absence from Roland's ceiling lens. When the chime echoed through the hallway, I stood, dragged my hands through my tangled hair, and forced my breathing into a shallow, erratic rhythm. I unlocked the front door. Daphne stood on the porch, holding a wicker basket covered with a checkered cloth. She wore a tailored cashmere trench coat, her posture impeccably straight, projecting the image of a polished, concerned sibling. She pushed past me without waiting for an invitation, stepping into the foyer. "I brought blueberry scones," she announced, her voice dripping with fabricated sympathy. "You need to eat. Reagan, you look absolutely hollow." She moved deeper into the house, her heels clicking aggressively against the floorboards. I trailed behind her, intentionally dragging my feet. Daphne placed the basket on the granite island, directly beneath the compromised smoke detector. I watched her eyes dart around the space. She scanned the living room, her gaze lingering for a fraction of a second on the mantelpiece, then shifting to the dining table. She was conducting a visual audit of Roland's surveillance equipment, ensuring I had not disturbed their transmitters. I approached the kettle, filling it with tap water. I engaged my physical performance. I intentionally loosened the muscles in my forearm, forcing my wrist to shake. As I poured the boiling water into the porcelain teacups, I let the spout rattle violently against the ceramic rim. Scalding liquid sloshed over the edge, pooling on the countertop. "Oh, let me," Daphne cooed, rushing forward. She snatched the kettle from my grip and guided me toward the bar stool. I slumped onto the seat, wrapping my arms around my torso. Daphne positioned herself behind me. She began stroking my hair, her manicured nails scraping gently against my scalp. She murmured sweet, hollow reassurances about time healing all wounds and the importance of leaning on family. I stared at the floor tiles. The juxtaposition of her physical comfort against the knowledge of her digital execution of our grandfather created a sickening friction in the room. I let a ragged sob escape my throat. Daphne continued to stroke my hair, but her attention drifted. Through the reflection in the polished stainless steel refrigerator door, I monitored her face. Her expression remained completely devoid of empathy. She stared directly up at the smoke detector lens, flashing a quick, subtle smirk meant exclusively for Roland, who sat monitoring the feed miles away. I buried my face in my hands, feeding them the exact data they craved. 30 minutes later, Daphne gathered her coat. She kissed my cheek, leaving a smear of crimson lipstick on my skin, and promised to return that evening with Roland to discuss Elias's remaining affairs. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind her. I waited exactly 60 seconds. I wiped the lipstick from my cheek with the back of my hand. The trembling vanished. My spine straightened. The weeping widow evaporated, replaced entirely by the actuary. I initiated the counteroffensive. Roland built his surveillance grid entirely inside the structure, prioritizing the living spaces. I possessed the exterior advantage. I moved exclusively through the mapped dead zones, hugging the baseboards and bypassing the living room perimeter entirely. I slipped out the side access door in the garage, retrieving the tactical gear I purchased the night before. I deployed 3 military-grade acoustic transmitters. These devices utilize directional microphones, capable of isolating and capturing hushed frequencies through concrete and glass without emitting a detectable electronic signature. I bypassed the interior rooms entirely. I crawled beneath the elevated wooden decking of the front porch, anchoring the first transmitter directly behind the lattice framework, aiming the receiver toward the front steps. I navigated the perimeter of the driveway, locating a loose brick in the retaining wall. I secured the second bug deep within the crevice, pointing it toward the designated guest parking space. I mounted the final transmitter above the garage track, capturing any audio bouncing off the concrete slab. I constructed an impenetrable acoustic net outside the walls of my home. Roland and Daphne assumed the driveway served as a secure staging area. They believed the house represented the boundary of their operation. They severely miscalculated the perimeter. Dusk descended, bringing a bitter, freezing wind. Headlights swept across the plantation shutters, casting elongated shadows against the hallway walls. The gravel crunched beneath the tires of Roland's luxury SUV. I immediately retreated to the master bathroom. I locked the heavy brass handle. I turned the shower dials to maximum heat, twisting the shower head to strike the fiberglass tub directly. Scalding water drummed against the floor, generating a dense, roaring curtain of white noise. Steam billowed, clouding the vanity mirrors and dampening the wallpaper. I sat on the edge of the porcelain tub, entirely clothed. I extracted the encrypted receiver from my pocket, inserted the earpiece, and activated the designated frequency. The audio feed crackled, then stabilized. The driveway transmitter picked up the slamming of car doors. Roland and Daphne did not immediately approach the porch. Their footsteps crunched against the gravel, halting directly adjacent to the brick retaining wall. "She is completely shattered," Daphne said, her voice transmitting with crystal clarity through the earpiece. I watched her try to pour tea this morning. Her hands shook so violently she scalded herself. She possesses zero fight left. "Excellent," Roland replied. His tone lacked any inflection, mimicking the cadence of a corporate merger discussion. "We accelerate the timeline. I cannot float the offshore margins for another 14 days. The creditors initiated secondary warnings this morning. We finalized the liquidation tonight." I held my breath, pressing the earpiece deeper into my canal. "You secured the compound?" Daphne asked. "A broker supplied the synthetic fentanyl an hour ago," Roland confirmed. The rustle of fabric transmitted through the microphone as he likely checked his coat pocket. "The chemical structure is highly concentrated. I reviewed her medical files. She maintains a prescription for a standard benzodiazepine to manage anxiety." Roland detailed the execution blueprint with chilling, mechanical precision. "While you distract her in the living room, I will access the master bathroom. The capsules pull apart easily. I will extract the prescribed powder and replace it with the synthetic fentanyl. I only need to alter 3 capsules to ensure a lethal dose." He paused, the gravel crunching beneath his leather shoes. "The coroner will order a toxicology screen. The blood work will reveal a massive opioid overdose. Given the tragic loss of her husband and the visible deterioration of her mental state over the past 4 days, the authorities will rule it an accidental overdose. A grieving widow, desperately seeking sleep, tragically miscalculating her dosage. The narrative closes the file instantly." I waited for Daphne to react. I waited for a gasp, a moment of hesitation, or a single shred of biological loyalty to override her greed. Daphne laughed. The sound transmitted through the receiver a sharp, cruel, grating chuckle that cut through the freezing night air. "A poetic tragedy," Daphne murmured, her voice dripping with amusement. She always favored logic. She would appreciate the mathematical efficiency of an accidental overdose. "Make sure you wear gloves when you handle the capsules. We cannot leave epidermal traces on the plastic." "I brought surgical latex," Roland assured her. "Let us proceed. Look sad when she opens the door." Their footsteps advanced toward the porch. I pulled the earpiece from my ear and terminated the receiver connection. I stood up from the edge of the tub. The bathroom remained thick with steam, the scalding water continuing to hammer against the fiberglass. I walked toward the vanity and raised my hand. I dragged my palm across the fogged mirror, clearing a wide, circular path through the condensation. I stared directly into my own eyes. No tears blurred my vision. My pulse beat a slow, rhythmic tempo against my throat. The audio recording severed the final, fraying tether binding me to my past, the girl who braided my hair, the sister who shared my childhood bedroom, the family member I protected for decades. She ceased to exist. Daphne chose her path. She stood in my driveway, laughing at the prospect of my corpse, actively plotting to stop my heart to fund a fraudulent offshore bank account. The woman standing on my front porch was no longer a sibling. She was a hostile asset. She was an immediate, lethal threat requiring permanent liquidation. I smoothed the front of my shirt, turned off the shower, and walked out to unlock the front door, preparing to welcome the assassins into my home. I welcomed them into the foyer that evening, playing the exhausted, fragile host. I anchored myself to the living room armchair, pulling a woven blanket tightly over my knees. When Daphne offered to tidy the kitchen, I insisted she sit beside me. When Roland excused himself to use the restroom, I requested he review a stack of Elias's life insurance policies I deliberately scattered across the coffee table. I cornered them with my engineered vulnerability. I denied Roland the navigational freedom required to access the master bathroom. The evening dragged, choked by fabricated sympathy, but it concluded with 0 casualties. They departed at 10 o'clock, the synthetic fentanyl still resting uselessly inside Roland's tailored pocket. They retreated to recalculate their assault. 3 days ticked past. I existed within a state of hypervigilance, moving through the house while consciously feeding data to the surveillance grid. I left half-eaten meals on the counter. I stared blankly at television static. I ensured the hidden lens in the smoke detector recorded a woman spiraling into catatonic depression. Outside the perimeter, Elias and Silas worked the shadows, constructing the framework for our retaliation. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Roland entered my living room. He did not bother knocking, utilizing the spare key Daphne had undoubtedly duplicated. He wore a charcoal bespoke suit, the fabric draping flawlessly across his shoulders. A predatory, unyielding confidence radiated from his posture. He carried a thick, leather-bound portfolio. Roland bypassed the armchairs and stood directly over me. He unclasped the portfolio and extracted a dense stack of legal documents. He dropped the paperwork onto the glass surface of the coffee table. The heavy paper slapped against the glass with a definitive thud. "Reagan," Roland began, his tone dripping with patronizing authority. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and took a seat opposite me. Elias left behind a fragmented estate. Probate is looming. The courts freeze assets, halt mortgage payments, and lock credit lines. You are in no condition to navigate a bureaucratic labyrinth. I leaned forward, wrapping my hands around a glass of ice water resting on a coaster. "I can manage the accounts." Roland offered a sympathetic, synthetic smile. "You possess a brilliant actuarial mind, but trauma compromises logic. I managed Thaddeus's transitions. I can consolidate Elias's assets, shield your properties from probate, and manage the immediate liabilities. I prepared the necessary authorizations. It simply requires your signature." I shifted my gaze to the top page of the stack. My eyes scanned the dense, capitalized legal text. My risk assessment training isolated the critical clauses instantly. It was not a standard financial consolidation form. It was a comprehensive, irrevocable power of attorney. I tracked the paragraphs. Roland drafted the document to grant himself absolute, unrestricted control over my financial portfolio, real estate holdings, and trust allocations. More alarmingly, I identified a deeply buried healthcare proxy clause. The paperwork surrendered my medical directives entirely to him if I signed this document, and Daphne subsequently laced my medication with the synthetic fentanyl. Roland possessed the legal authority to block any toxicology screens, dictate my emergency care, and pull life support without interference. He constructed a perfect, legally binding execution chamber. He simply needed me to step inside and lock the door myself. "The terminology is quite dense," Roland said, producing a heavy silver fountain pen from his breast pocket. He unscrewed the cap, extending the instrument toward me. "It grants me temporary administrative oversight. Sign the bottom of page 4 and initial the addendums. I will handle the rest." I needed time. Elias required a designated window to finalize the federal trap with our external contacts. If I explicitly refused to sign, Roland would recognize the defiance, escalate his timeline, and likely resort to immediate brute force. I had to reject the document without rejecting his authority. I needed to weaponize my fabricated trauma. I initiated a calculated stall tactic. I stared at the paperwork, widening my eyes to simulate mounting panic. I dropped my jaw slightly, pulling short, jagged breaths into my lungs. I elevated my heart rate, forcing blood to flush my cheeks. I raised a trembling hand, clutching the fabric of my sweater directly over my sternum. "I cannot process this," I gasped, shaking my head frantically from side to side. The legal jargon, the clauses. It looks exactly like the paperwork I signed at the funeral home. Roland leaned forward, his synthetic smile straining. Reagan, breathe. It is standard administrative text. No, I choked out, elevating the pitch of my voice. I squeezed my eyes shut, rocking my torso forward and backward. It means he is gone. Signing this means Elias is permanently gone. I cannot erase him. I cannot overwrite his name. I reached for the glass of ice water, ensuring my hand spasmed violently as my fingers grazed the condensation. I knocked the glass sideways. It rolled off the edge of the coffee table and impacted the hardwood floor. The heavy crystal shattered, launching jagged shards and freezing water across the polished planks. I let out a piercing, hysterical wail and collapsed laterally onto the sofa cushions. I pulled my knees toward my chest, curling into a tight, defensive posture, and buried my face into the upholstery. I hyperventilated, dragging rapid breaths into my airway, mimicking a textbook clinical panic attack. Through the slits of my fingers, I monitored Roland. The mask of the sympathetic wealth manager shattered. The tendons in his neck pulled taut, his jaw locked, the muscles grinding furiously. Absolute, venomous frustration radiated from his narrowed eyes. His offshore creditors were closing in, his margins were evaporating, and the woman holding his $12 million salvation was weeping on a sofa over a spilled glass of water. He stood up, his leather shoes crunching against the broken crystal. He stepped over the puddle, grabbed my upper arm, and yanked me upright. His grip bruised my bicep. "Stop this immediately," Roland hissed. Abandoning his patronizing tone, he shoved the silver fountain pen into my trembling palm, closing my fingers around the cold metal. "You are acting like a child. Sign the document. Reagan. Sign it right now." I squeezed my eyes shut and wailed louder, letting the pen slip from my grip and bounce across the legal documents. The front door opened. Daphne hurried into the living room, carrying shopping bags. She assessed the shattered glass, Roland's aggressive posture, and my hysterical collapse. Her socialite instincts kicked in, recognizing the tactical error in applying brute force to a volatile asset. "Roland, release her," Daphne commanded, dropping her bags in the foyer. She rushed forward, inserting herself between us. She wedged her body against the sofa, playing the designated peacemaker. Roland stepped back, straightening his lapels, his chest heaving with suppressed rage. "She refuses to finalize the asset consolidation. The estate will incur massive penalties if we delay." Daphne wrapped an arm around my shaking shoulders. "Look at her. Roland, she is completely overwhelmed. The trauma is triggering a severe anxiety response." Daphne stroked my back, her voice projecting artificial warmth. "She cannot read legal jargon in this state. It is too soon." "We do not have time for mourning delays," Roland snapped. "Give her 48 hours, Daphne countered, establishing the boundary. She looked at Roland, communicating silently through narrowed eyes. She assured him that 48 hours provided ample time to deploy the synthetic fentanyl, rendering the signature entirely unnecessary. "Let her rest. Let the anxiety medication do its job. We will revisit the paperwork on Friday." Roland stared at me, his gaze calculating and cold. He picked up his silver pen from the table, capped it, and slid it back into his pocket. 48 hours, he agreed, his voice a low, mechanical hum. "I will return on Friday at noon. The estate cannot wait any longer." I nodded weakly against the sofa cushions. I wiped my face with the back of my sleeve, staring at the shattered glass on the floor. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice trembling perfectly. "Thank you for your patience. I just need time." Daphne patted my knee, a victorious smirk ghosting across her lips. They gathered their coats and exited the house, entirely convinced they controlled the timeline. The heavy oak door clicked shut. I stopped crying. My breathing stabilized instantly. I sat up, brushing a stray lock of hair from my forehead. I stared at the irrevocable power of attorney resting on the glass table. Roland and Daphne thought they had generously granted a weeping widow a brief reprieve. They had no idea they had just handed me the exact 48-hour window Elias and I required to finalize the federal trap that would bury them alive. I waited until the digital clock on the microwave displayed 2 in the morning. I descended the basement stairs, stepping deliberately on the outer edges of the wooden treads to silence any groaning hinges. I bypassed Roland's ground floor surveillance perimeter entirely. I unlatched the rusted iron latch of the subterranean storm doors, pushed the heavy timber upward, and slipped into the freezing, damp night. I navigated the perimeter fence, reached my vehicle parked 3 streets over, and drove toward the industrial district. Silas secured a secondary staging area, an abandoned municipal pumping station. I engaged the heavy steel door, inside, and tactical lighting illuminated a sprawling folding table buried under topographical maps and networked laptops. Elias stood beside the makeshift command center. Silas guarded the perimeter. Seated at the primary terminal was Detective Valerie Garza. Garza possessed 30 years of financial crime experience, forged in federal task forces and sharpened by a profound, vocal disdain for the compromised, bribe-hungry local precinct. She did not wear a uniform. She wore a tailored blazer and a skeptical scowl, her fingers hovering over an encrypted keyboard. I approached the table and slapped the copied power of attorney documents onto the metal surface. "He demands absolute control," I stated, tapping the irrevocable clauses. "He granted a 48-hour extension." Garza pulled the documents closer, scanning the dense legal text. She typed a sequence of commands into her terminal, accessing classified federal financial databases. She cross-referenced the holding entities Roland listed in the consolidation addendums against international routing registries. "Look at this architecture," Garza instructed, tilting the monitor toward Elias and me. Green text cascaded across the black screen. "He established a labyrinth of offshore shell companies. He funneled your grandfather's stolen capital through these ghosts to float a highly illegal, massively leveraged real estate syndicate in a non-extradition jurisdiction." I synthesized the data streams. The numbers painted a picture of absolute, impending catastrophe. Roland borrowed against the initial stolen capital, leveraging phantom assets to secure exorbitant construction loans from unregulated international lenders. "His margins are collapsing," Elias noted, tracing the debt structure. "The initial capital evaporated. The project stalled." Garza executed another query, isolating the primary loan covenants. He triggered a balloon payment clause. The syndicate defaults in exactly 48 hours. If he fails to inject fresh liquidity, the holding company collapses. The puzzle assembled itself perfectly. The lenders are not banks, I deduced, recognizing the specific offshore routing nodes. They are cartel affiliates. They do not foreclose on properties. They execute defaulters. "Roland faces imminent liquidation," Garza confirmed. "He desperately requires the remaining trust shares to satisfy the debt and avoid retaliation. He needs your 80% of the $12 million. I stared at the glowing monitor. Roland occupied my house and drank my scotch, projecting the illusion of an untouchable wealth manager. In reality, he stood on a trapdoor with a noose around his neck, begging me to pull the lever. "We do not stop him," I announced. Elias looked up, his brow furrowing. "If he secures the signature, he initiates the transfer." "We map the operation," I countered, leaning over the table. "We orchestrate a specialized sting. Garza, I require a heavily monitored, federally secured wire network." Garza's eyes locked onto mine, tracking my strategy. "You want to let him execute the transaction." "I want to hand him the pen," I confirmed. "We allow Roland to believe he successfully coerced my signature. We let him initiate the final transfer of the estate funds. The moment he hits execute, he pushes stolen capital across a federal wire, locking himself into undeniable, premeditated wire fraud. It elevates a domestic dispute into a federal felony," Garza murmured, a predatory smile breaking across her face. "The federal authorities assume jurisdiction immediately. Local corruption cannot shield him. We isolate the offshore accounts receiving the funds," I continued, cementing the architecture of our retaliation. We coordinate with international authorities to freeze the syndicate's holding accounts the millisecond the wire clears. I looked at Elias, then back to Garza. I did not merely intend to lock Roland inside a concrete cell. I am going to let him taste salvation, I declared, my voice echoing against the concrete walls of the pumping station. I am going to let him believe he secured the $12 million and appease the cartel. Then, I am going to pull the capital out from under him. I am not just going to send them to prison. I am going to financially obliterate them. Daphne dragged a heavy leather suitcase across the hardwood foyer the following evening. She abandoned her bags in the guest room doorway, loudly declaring her intention to remain on the premises until the legal documents were finalized. She claimed my deteriorating psychological state required continuous supervision. I offered a weak, compliant nod, wrapped a knit shawl around my shoulders, and retreated to the master suite. I did not close my door. I positioned myself adjacent to the doorframe, utilizing the precise angle of the hallway mirror. The glass reflected the corridor, offering a clear line of sight to the guest room threshold. I held my breath, listening to the metallic clatter of Daphne unzipping her luggage. A moment later, her silhouette appeared in the mirror. She checked her surroundings, scanning the empty hallway, and slipped silently into my master bathroom. I checked my watch, locking my eyes onto the sweeping second hand. I counted the revolutions. I waited precisely 3 minutes. Daphne emerged from the bathroom, smoothing the front of her cashmere sweater. Her heels clicked rapidly as she descended the main staircase, retreating to the kitchen to undoubtedly inform Roland that the first phase of their operation was complete. I abandoned my position by the doorframe and entered the bathroom. I approached the double vanity. My prescription amber cylinder sat on the polished marble counter. It rested slightly misaligned. The printed pharmacy label rotated 45 degrees from its standard, forward-facing position. I unscrewed the childproof cap, pressing down and twisting until the plastic locking mechanism clicked. I retrieved a pair of stainless steel tweezers from my cosmetic drawer. Carefully, I extracted 3 capsules, dropping them onto a white porcelain dish. I gripped the edges of the first capsule between my thumb and index finger and twisted, separating the 2 gelatin halves. A fine white powder spilled onto the porcelain surface. I leaned in, analyzing the texture under the harsh vanity lighting. My standard anxiety medication featured a distinct, shimmering crystalline grain. This substance clumped together, presenting a chalky, dense residue. It was the synthetic fentanyl Roland had procured from his black market broker. I carried the porcelain dish to the sink. I swept the lethal powder down the stainless steel drain and flushed the plumbing with scalding water, ensuring 0 residue remained to contaminate the basin. I opened the medicine cabinet and retrieved a bottle of over-the-counter vitamin B supplements. I placed 2 yellow tablets onto the dish, using the heavy, blunt handle of a makeup brush. I crushed the tablets, grinding them against the porcelain until they pulverized into a fine, pale dust. I methodically funneled the crushed vitamins into the empty gelatin halves. I snapped the modified capsules back together, pressing the edges firmly to verify the seals. I dropped the pills back into the amber cylinder. I secured the cap, rotated the label to match Daphne's exact misaligned placement on the marble, and exited the room, leaving the trap perfectly reset. That night, Daphne pushed open my bedroom door. She carried a crystal tumbler filled with ice water in her left hand, her right hand gripping the amber pill bottle. She approached the mattress, her shadow stretching across the heavy duvet. "Time to rest, Reagan," Daphne murmured, her tone mimicking gentle concern. I sat up against the headboard, pulling the blankets tightly to my chest. I extended a trembling palm. Daphne tipped the amber bottle, shaking 2 capsules directly into my hand. She handed me the crystal tumbler. I placed the modified vitamins on my tongue. I lifted the glass, swallowed heavily, and handed the tumbler back to her. Daphne did not break eye contact. Her gaze remained locked onto my throat, watching the muscles contract as I swallowed the pills she believed contained a fatal dose of synthetic opioids. I laid back against the pillows. I closed my eyes. I immediately engaged my physical performance. Dropping my jaw slightly and slackening my facial muscles, I dragged slow, rhythmic breaths into my lungs, simulating the rapid onset of a deep, chemical sedation. I focused entirely on my autonomic responses, forcing my heart rate to decelerate, projecting the image of a woman slipping into an irreversible coma. Daphne did not leave the room. I monitored her presence through the subtle shifts in the ambient lighting against my eyelids and the faint rustle of her clothing. She stepped closer to the mattress. She stood directly over my bed. She remained anchored to the floorboards for a full 5 minutes. She did not speak. She did not reach out to check my pulse. She did not simulate any form of panic or grief. She stood entirely motionless, a silent sentinel in the dark, her face utterly devoid of emotion. She was simply waiting for my respiratory system to fail. She was waiting for my heart to stop beating so she could claim her inheritance. The bedside lamp clicked off, plunging the room into absolute darkness. The bedroom door creaked shut, the brass latch engaging with a soft, definitive click. I opened my eyes in the pitch-black room. I stared at the ceiling shadows. My pulse beat against my throat, steady, rhythmic, and ice-cold. Dawn filtered through the plantation shutters, casting thin, gray lines of light across the hardwood floor of the master bedroom. I kicked away the tangled duvet. I did not linger in the bed. The 48-hour window was closing, and the designated mourning period was officially terminated. I walked into the walk-in closet and bypassed the oversized, knitted sweaters and loose trousers I utilized for my grieving disguise. I reached into the back of the wardrobe and unzipped a protective garment bag. I extracted a bespoke, tailored black suit. The structured wool fabric felt heavy and substantial against my skin. It did not drape, it armored. I fastened the buttons of the blazer, tucking a crisp white blouse beneath the lapels. I pulled my hair back, twisting it into a tight, severe knot at the nape of my neck, securing it with rigid metallic pins. I checked my reflection in the full-length mirror, the shattered, hyperventilating widow who collapsed over a spilled glass of water ceased to exist. An apex predator stared back at me. I retrieved my encrypted mobile device and my leather briefcase, stepping out of the master suite. I descended the main staircase, my heels striking the wooden treads with a sharp, rhythmic, and uncompromising cadence. The scent of roasted espresso wafted from the kitchen. Daphne stood near the granite island, bathed in the pale morning sunlight. She wore a pristine silk robe, holding a steaming ceramic mug in her right hand. She faced the window, gazing out at the frosted lawn, undoubtedly calculating the logistics of contacting the coroner to remove my corpse from the premises. I stepped onto the kitchen tile. The sharp click of my heel echoed against the backsplash. Daphne pivoted. Her eyes tracked the sound, expecting to see a first responder or perhaps Roland arriving to confirm the kill. Instead, her gaze locked onto my face. Her neurological system completely failed to process the visual data. The ceramic mug slipped through her relaxed fingers, plummeting toward the floor. It impacted the granite counter edge, shattering into jagged porcelain shrapnel. Boiling coffee splashed across the pristine white floor tiles and splattered onto the hem of her silk robe. Daphne did not flinch from the scalding liquid. The blood drained from her face in an instant, leaving her skin a sickly, translucent ash. Her jaw unhinged slightly. She stared at my chest, tracking the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of my breathing. I watched her pupils dilate in absolute, paralyzing horror. The woman she personally poisoned last night was currently standing in the kitchen, perfectly composed, wearing a tailored suit. I did not break eye contact. I walked calmly to the paper towel dispenser, tore off a length of sheets, and crouched to wipe the spilled coffee from the tiles. "Good morning, Daphne," I greeted, my voice projecting a bright, flawless stability. I gathered the shattered porcelain fragments, depositing them into the waste bin. I turned back to face her, offering a pristine, polite smile. "I slept remarkably well," I stated, retrieving a fresh mug from the cabinet and pouring myself a measure of black coffee. I lifted the rim to my lips, taking a slow sip. "That new vitamin regimen is working absolute wonders for my fatigue. I feel entirely rejuvenated." The words struck her like physical blows. She gripped the edge of the granite island, her knuckles turning bone white. desperately trying to anchor herself to a reality that had just fractured. She remained trapped inside an impossible paradox. If she demanded to know how I survived, she confessed to the attempted murder. She swallowed hard, her throat bobbing, entirely stripped of her socialite arrogance. She could not formulate a single syllable. I pulled my mobile phone from my blazer pocket. I selected Roland's contact and activated the speakerphone, placing the device flat on the granite island so Daphne could hear every word. The line rang twice. Roland answered. His voice sounded thick, gravelly, and expectant. "Daphne?" he asked, assuming she was calling from my device to announce the discovery of my body. "Roland, good morning," I chirped, injecting my tone with a manufactured, compliant brightness. A sharp, audible intake of breath transmitted through the speaker. A heavy, suffocating silence stretched across the line as Roland's brain scrambled to recalibrate. "Reagan," he finally stammered, his vocal cords tightening, fighting to regain his authoritative cadence. "You are awake early." "I am," I replied smoothly. "I reviewed the consolidation clauses overnight. I apologize for my reaction the other day. I understand the urgency now. I am ready to finalize the estate transfers and sign the power of attorney." Another pause. The rustle of fabric echoed through the speaker as he likely stood up from his desk. "You are ready to sign the documents today." "I am," I confirmed. "Let us handle the paperwork at your office. I prefer a professional environment. I will meet you at your downtown law firm at 12 o'clock exactly. Please ensure the notary is present." 12 o'clock, Roland repeated, his voice shifting from shock to a desperate, grasping greed. The prospect of securing the $12 million overrode his confusion regarding my survival. "I will have the boardroom prepared." I terminated the connection. I picked up my briefcase, taking one final sip of my coffee. Daphne stared at me, her hands shaking violently against the countertop. She snatched her phone from her robe pocket, her thumbs striking the glass screen with frantic, uncoordinated desperation as she scrambled to text Roland and explain the catastrophic failure of the synthetic fentanyl. I walked past her, exiting the house and stepping into the crisp morning air. The bait was successfully deployed. While Daphne panicked in my kitchen, the true operation executed miles away. Silas Thorne and my husband did not remain idle during the night. They spent the dark hours mapping and penetrating Roland's downtown stronghold. Roland's firm occupied the 14th floor of a heavily secured glass high-rise. He believed the biometric scanners, the lobby security personnel, and the encrypted elevator banks rendered his executive boardroom impenetrable. He severely underestimated the logistical expertise of a forensic data analyst and a retired private investigator. Silas executed the physical breach at 3 o'clock in the morning. Utilizing a cloned municipal maintenance credential, he bypassed the lobby security desk, masquerading as a structural inspector addressing a fabricated gas leak alert. Silas accessed the subterranean utility shafts, bypassing the freight elevator security protocols entirely. Elias shadowed him, carrying heavy cases of tactical surveillance hardware. They bypassed the biometric scanners on the 14th floor boardroom doors by penetrating the ceiling crawl spaces. Elias crawled through the aluminum ventilation ducts, snaking fiber optic cables through the galvanized steel. Working with surgical precision, Elias dropped dual, high-definition microscopic lenses directly behind the intake grills of the air conditioning returns. He embedded a third wide-angle lens inside the casing of the emergency fire sprinkler, positioned directly over the center of the mahogany conference table. He anchored specialized acoustic transmitters to the underside of the table, capable of capturing a whisper from 30 feet away. Elias wired the feeds outward, establishing an encrypted, localized transmission link that bypassed the building's internal network entirely. 2 blocks down the avenue, parked inside a multi-level concrete parking structure, Detective Valerie Garza sat inside a reinforced, unmarked federal utility van. The interior of the van hummed with the processing power of a mobile federal command center. Garza routed the incoming audio and visual data streams directly into her secured servers. She possessed a crystal-clear, multi-angle view of every square inch of Roland's boardroom. The trap transitioned from a concept into a digital fortress. Roland sat in his corner office, adjusting his silk tie, staring out at his panoramic view of the city skyline. He believed he had successfully coerced a shattered, compliant woman into surrendering an empire. He believed the $12 million would clear his offshore syndicate debts before the sun set. He believed he possessed absolute control over his domain. He had absolutely no idea he had just unlocked the gates to his inner sanctum, circumvented his own security, and invited the executioner directly inside. The polished steel doors of the elevator slid shut, sealing Daphne and me inside the ascending cabin. The digital floor indicator blinked, counting upward in a steady, rhythmic progression: 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Daphne stood flanking my right shoulder, nervous. Kinetic energy radiated from her frame, contaminating the confined space. She gripped the leather handle of her designer handbag until the skin across her knuckles stretched taut and bone-white. The catastrophic failure of her morning poisoning attempt had entirely fractured her baseline composure. She expected to escort a sluggish, sedated victim to the slaughter. Instead, she walked beside a fully armored, operational actuary. The elevator chimed, the doors parted, revealing the reception area of Roland's downtown law firm. We stepped onto the plush, sound-dampening carpet. We navigated the quiet corridor, approaching the primary executive boardroom. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls encased the space, offering a panoramic view of the gray city skyline. Roland anchored the head of the massive mahogany conference table. He wore a tailored navy suit, his spine straight, his hands resting flat against the polished wood. He projected absolute authority, adopting the posture of a monarch preparing to secure a vast empire. Yet, decades of evaluating risk trained my eyes to isolate microscopic behavioral anomalies. I tracked the rapid, erratic tapping of Roland's left index finger against the mahogany. I noted the subtle flaring of his nostrils and the rigid tension locking his jaw. He desperately required this capital transfer to satisfy his cartel creditors before his final offshore deadline expired. A middle-aged man occupied a leather chair relegated to the far corner of the room. He clutched an ink stamp and a brass embosser. He was the designated notary, pre-purchased and compromised, secured to authenticate my forced surrender. I crossed the threshold, stepping onto the hardwood perimeter. Roland ceased tapping his finger. He stood, gesturing toward the leather chair positioned directly opposite him. I bypassed his offered seat. I selected the chair adjacent to the primary display monitor, fundamentally altering the spatial geometry of the room and denying him the direct, head-on dominance he sought to establish. I unbuttoned my black blazer, sat down, and pulled the thick stack of legal documents toward my chest. Roland cleared his throat, adjusting his silk tie. He withdrew a heavy silver fountain pen from his breast pocket. He slid the instrument across the polished mahogany. The metal cylinder rolled, stopping exactly parallel to the paper stack. "The clauses remain identical to the draft I presented at your home," Roland stated, his voice maintaining a patronizing, soothing cadence. "The notary will authenticate the signature. We will file the transfer with the probate courts this afternoon, shielding Elias's assets and consolidating your grandfather's trust." I picked up the silver pen. The metal felt cold and substantial against my palm. I removed the cap, exposing the sharp ink-stained nib. I positioned my hand over the final page of the irrevocable power of attorney. I lowered the point, hovering exactly 2 millimeters above the dotted signature line. Daphne exhaled a jagged, rattling breath, her shoulders collapsing in premature relief. She stepped away from the table, retreating toward the glass wall. Roland leaned forward, his eyes locking onto the nib, waiting for the ink to bleed into the fiber of the page. I halted my hand. I did not apply downward pressure. I lifted my chin and locked my gaze directly onto Roland's pupils. I dropped the weeping, compliant facade instantly. My expression hardened into a mask of absolute, predatory calculation. The silence inside the boardroom stretched, growing heavy, dense, and suffocating. Roland's manufactured smile faltered. A deep furrow etched itself between his eyebrows. "Reagan," Roland prompted, his vocal cords tightening. He tapped the table. "The notary is waiting on an hourly retainer." I lowered the pen, resting it against the margin of the document. Section 4, paragraph B. I recited entirely from memory. maintaining unblinking, terrifying eye contact. This clause grants the fiduciary unrestricted authority to liquidate all domestic real estate holdings and transfer the resulting capital into external holding entities. I flipped the heavy parchment pages backward, the paper snapping sharply in the quiet room. Section 7 overrides all previous medical directives, I continued, elevating my volume to a crisp, clinical register. It transfers total health proxy control to you. It revokes my right to demand toxicology screens or dictate my own emergency care. Roland shifted his weight, gripping the armrests of his chair. It is standard consolidation phrasing for high net worth estates. We discussed this. Standard phrasing applies to domestic, regulated trusts, I countered, slicing through his defense. It does not apply to leveraging my grandfather's stolen assets to float a collapsing offshore real estate syndicate. The corrupt notary in the corner stiffened, dropping his brass embosser onto his lap. Daphne pressed her back flat against the glass wall, her breathing accelerating into shallow gasps. I read risk for a living. Roland, I stated, leaning forward and resting my forearms against the mahogany table. I analyze financial failures. You are utilizing a Caymans-based shell entity. You require my 80% of the $12 million to cover the massive balloon payment, defaulting in exactly 36 hours. You owe unregulated international lenders. You owe cartel affiliates. The color drained entirely from Roland's neck, a sickly pallor creeping upward toward his jawline. He opened his mouth, attempting to formulate a denial, but his throat seized. I memorized the SWIFT codes, I pressed, closing the trap around him. I recited the exact 15-digit offshore routing numbers Elias extracted from the digital ledgers. I rattled off the international bank identifiers and the encrypted holding account designations without breaking eye contact. I tracked the massive capital hemorrhages you initiated weeks prior to Thaddeus's death, I explained, dissecting his predatory strategy aloud. You drained the liquid assets. You manufactured an artificial deficit to fund your failing construction project. Now, the syndicate threatens your life, and you need my signature to funnel the remaining estate into a black hole to save yourself. Roland pushed his chair back. The leather squeaked against the hardwood floor. Panic flared behind his eyes. Wild and unrestrained, he glanced at the notary, then back to me, realizing the depth of the intelligence breach. I lifted the silver fountain pen. I tapped the heavy metal casing against the mahogany table. 1, 2, 3. A fascinating variable emerged during my risk assessment of your financial timeline, I casually mentioned, lowering my voice to a lethal, precise whisper. The tapping ceased. My grandfather utilized a wireless cardiac pacemaker, I stated. Modern units upload diagnostic data. I pulled the medical telemetry. I paused, letting the implications fill the sterile boardroom air. Roland stopped breathing. I isolated a massive, localized frequency spike, I revealed, delivering the final, fatal blow to his reality. The telemetry registered a catastrophic digital override exactly 4 minutes before his cardiac arrest. You hired a technician to induce ventricular fibrillation. The atmosphere inside the glass boardroom shattered like a dropped mirror. The remaining oxygen evaporated. Roland sat frozen, entirely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his exposure. The smug, predatory wealth manager completely disintegrated. His eyes darted across my face, desperately searching for a bluff, finding only cold, numerical, absolute truth. He realized he had not lured a grieving, compliant widow into his stronghold to sign away an empire. He realized the woman sitting across from him had mapped his offshore accounts, intercepted his poison, accessed federal medical data, and was currently actively dismantling his entire criminal architecture from the inside out. I released Roland from my visual grip. I rotated my leather chair exactly 45 degrees, aligning my posture directly toward the glass wall where my sister cowered. Daphne pressed her spine against the reinforced pane, her breathing erratic and shallow. Her fingers dug into the quilted leather of her designer handbag, her knuckles stretching the skin until it blanched. The catastrophic failure of her morning poisoning attempt had already fractured her baseline composure. Now, Watching me surgically eviscerate her fiancé's offshore syndicate completely shattered her remaining cognitive defenses. I leaned back against the upholstery, crossing my legs, resting my elbows on the armrests, and steepling my fingers. I did not raise my voice. I projected my words with a quiet, lethal, and calculated disdain. I knew her psychological architecture intimately. I mapped her pressure points over 3 decades of shared existence. "You believed you engineered a masterpiece, Daphne," I stated, the syllables cutting through the sterile boardroom air like a scalpel. She flinched, her eyes darting between Roland and me. She swallowed heavily, incapable of producing a coherent response. 34 years of playing the victim," I continued, dissecting her character aloud. 34 years of coveting my academic records, my career, my stability. You constructed an entire identity around unearned status, masking a profound, gaping incompetence. I dropped my hands to the mahogany table, leaning forward slightly. I weaponized the memory of the grandfather she murdered. Thaddeus evaluated risk, just as I do, I revealed, stripping away her delusions of familial affection. He reviewed your expenditures. He tracked your escalating credit deficits, your failed ventures, and your endless demands for bailouts. He recognized the parasitic void inside you. Daphne's jaw trembled. Her manicured nails scraped against the leather of her handbag. "The estate structure was not a bureaucratic oversight," I explained, delivering the truth with brutal precision. "Thaddeus deliberately designed the trust to bypass you. He sequestered 80% of the $12 million behind my 39th birthday because he categorized you as a financial sinkhole. He knew you produced absolutely nothing of value, and he refused to let you squander his legacy." A low, guttural sound escaped Daphne's throat. The polished socialite facade began to peel away, exposing the feral, resentful creature writhing underneath. I pushed harder, shifting my crosshairs to her dependency. To bypass his final judgment, you anchored yourself to a desperate fraud. I gestured toward Roland, who remained paralyzed in his chair, sweating profusely. You tied your survival to a man drowning in cartel debt, a man who required you to orchestrate the execution of your own blood to satisfy his international lenders. "Shut up," Daphne hissed, her voice vibrating with a brittle, fraying edge. I ignored her command. I isolated the events of the previous night, bringing the synthetic fentanyl into the light. "When Roland instructed you to eliminate the final obstacle, you failed spectacularly," I mocked, infusing my tone with absolute contempt. "You lacked the basic competence to even execute a proper poisoning. You stood over my mattress, monitoring my respiratory rate, celebrating my impending death. You believed you administered a lethal dose of synthetic opioids. You administered crushed vitamin supplements. Daphne, I flushed your poison down the master bathroom drain 3 minutes after you manipulated the capsules." The revelation struck her physical form. Her shoulders jerked upward. Her eyes widened, the blood vessels fracturing, turning the sclera a manic, bloodshot red. The realization that she had been entirely outmaneuvered, that I had perceived her lethal intentions and mocked her incompetence, triggered a catastrophic psychological detonation. Decades of festering jealousy ignited. The pressure cracked the containment vessel. Daphne snapped. She hurled her designer handbag across the room. The heavy leather struck the mahogany table, knocking over a crystal water pitcher and scattering the irrevocable power of attorney documents across the hardwood floor. She lunged forward, closing the distance between the glass wall and the conference table in 3 rapid strides. She slammed both of her palms onto the polished wood, the impact echoing like a gunshot. "I deserved that estate!" Daphne shrieked, her voice tearing through her vocal cords, transforming into a raw, unhinged scream. Spit flew from her lips, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unrestrained hatred. I endured his endless lectures. I sat through his pathetic dinners, playing the obedient granddaughter. Roland flinched, snapping out of his paralysis as Daphne's volume escalated. "Daphne, stop talking," he ordered, panic bleeding into his tone. She ignored him entirely, locking her manic gaze onto my face. The dam broke. unleashing a torrent of self-incrimination. "I authorize the override," Daphne roared, her chest heaving violently. She leaned over the table, thrusting her face toward mine. "I told Roland to hire the technician. I gave him the medical access codes for the pacemaker. I watched the telemetry flatline, and I felt nothing but relief." The corrupt notary in the corner scrambled backward, pushing his leather chair against the wall, desperately attempting to distance himself from the active confession of a digital assassination. "Daphne!" Roland shouted, pushing himself out of his seat, his leather shoes slipping slightly on the spilled water. She whipped her head toward him, her blonde hair falling out of its pristine styling, hanging in ragged strands across her face. "Do not silence me. I did the work. I walked into her bathroom. I cracked open those capsules and I filled them with the powder you gave me. I wanted her to stop breathing." She turned back to me, her eyes burning with a venomous, triumphant rage, entirely oblivious to the tactical reality of her surroundings. "I swapped the pills. I planned to bury you right next to Elias, and I planned to spend every single cent of that $12 million. She shrieked her entire conspiracy into the open air, explicitly detailing their coordinated assassination of our grandfather and their premeditated attempt on my life. She handed me the murder weapon, complete with her own verbal fingerprints. Roland recognized the catastrophic legal fallout. He understood that a verbal confession of a federal crime, delivered in a corporate boardroom in front of a witness, guaranteed decades inside a concrete cell. His survival instincts mutated into brute force. He lunged across the corner of the mahogany table. He grabbed Daphne's upper arm, his fingers digging into her bicep with violent, bruising force. He twisted her shoulder backward, utilizing his momentum to rip her away from the table. "Shut your mouth!" Roland roared, a guttural, animalistic sound escaping his throat. He shoved her violently backward. Daphne lost her footing. Her heels slipped against the hardwood floor. She collided heavily with the glass wall, the impact rattling the reinforced panes. She crumpled to the floor, gasping for air, rubbing her bruised shoulder as she stared up at her fiancé in shock. Roland stood over her, his chest heaving, his fists clenched at his sides. He panted heavily, the silence of the boardroom rushing back in to fill the void left by her screams. He looked back at me, his eyes wide, wild, and utterly terrified. I did not move. I did not flinch during the physical altercation. I remained seated, my hands folded neatly in my lap. Roland believed he had successfully silenced the leak. He believed the damage was contained within the four walls of his 14th floor executive suite. He calculated the variables, assuming he only needed to neutralize me and bribe the notary to bury the confession. He severely miscalculated his environment. I stared at him, offering a cold, terrifying smile. Daphne's physical assault and her subsequent silencing meant absolutely nothing. The damage was permanent. The damage was irreversible. Directly above Roland's head, concealed inside the emergency fire sprinkler casing, Elias's wide-angle lens captured every frame of the violence. Embedded beneath the mahogany table, Silas's military-grade acoustic transmitters captured every single decibel of Daphne's hysterical shrieking. 2 blocks down the avenue, sitting inside a reinforced, unmarked federal utility van, Detective Valerie Garza monitored the live feed. Her encrypted servers recorded the entire confession, logging the audio signatures and the explicit admissions of the pacemaker hack and the synthetic fentanyl swap. Every single syllable had been captured on the federal wiretap. The trap had slammed shut, and the predators were officially locked inside the cage. Roland's chest heaved, expanding and contracting with erratic, jagged rhythm. He stood over Daphne's crumpled form, his eyes darting from her tear-streaked face to my placid, folded hands. The gears behind his pupils ground against each other, frantically attempting to process the sudden, catastrophic shift in his environment. I did not flinch when he threw Daphne into the glass. I did not scramble for the exit. I merely observed him. The realization struck him, visibly draining the remaining blood from his extremities. The calculated provocations, the precise recitation of his offshore routing codes, the deliberate unmasking of his pacemaker sabotage. It was not a domestic dispute. It was an interrogation. I had backed him into a corner and manipulated his partner into delivering a full, unredacted confession, he surmised, correctly, that I would not execute such a brazen maneuver without external support. Survival instincts, feral and unrefined, overrode his corporate veneer. Roland pivoted on his heel. Abandoning Daphne on the floorboards, he lunged toward the electronic access panel mounted beside the boardroom entrance. His palm slammed against the polycarbonate keypad. He bypassed the standard entry codes, hammering the emergency lockdown sequence. A heavy, synchronized mechanical thud echoed through the 14th floor. The red LED indicator above the threshold illuminated. Roland engaged the magnetic deadbolts, sealing the reinforced glass doors. He effectively isolated the boardroom, transforming his executive suite into a sealed vault. He turned back to face me, his breathing escalating into a frantic pant. His eyes mirrored a trapped predator, wild and entirely stripped of humanity. He reached inside the breast pocket of his bespoke jacket. His hand emerged, gripping a compact, matte black firearm. He raised the weapon, extending his arm, and leveled the muzzle directly at the center of my chest. "On the ground!" Roland roared, snapping his attention toward the corner of the room. The corrupt notary emitted a high-pitched, strangled whimper. He threw his hands over his head, dropping to his knees before collapsing flat against the hardwood floor. He buried his face in the carpet runner, shivering violently, entirely paralyzed by the sudden introduction of lethal force. Daphne remained frozen against the glass partition, pressing her palms against her mouth to stifle her own terrified gasps. Roland advanced toward the mahogany conference table, the firearm trembling slightly in his grip. The meticulously groomed wealth manager evaporated. Sweat beaded across his forehead, trailing down his temples and soaking into the starched collar of his dress shirt. His reality actively crumbled, and he desperately attempted to anchor it with violence. "Pick up the pen," Roland commanded, his voice a hoarse, ragged bark. He waved the barrel of the gun toward the scattered legal documents. "Sign the power of attorney. Sign it right now. Reagan." He required the ink, even facing imminent exposure. His mind remained chained to the $12 million. He believed a signed document might still salvage his offshore leverage, or perhaps fund his immediate flight from extradition. I did not reach for the silver fountain pen. I did not raise my hands in surrender. My actuarial training isolated the variables, evaluating the immediate threat. His hand shook. His stance was unbalanced. He lacked the stabilized core required for an accurate trigger pull under severe psychological distress. Furthermore, the surveillance net hummed invisibly around us. Detective Valerie Garza monitored the live feed. The introduction of a firearm altered the federal operational parameters. It escalated the protocol from an evidence-gathering sting to an immediate, tactical hostage rescue. I possessed absolute certainty in my calculus. The cavalry was already in motion. "The ink is useless, Roland," I stated, maintaining a low, even pitch. "You cannot wire capital from a federal penitentiary." "Sign the paper," he shrieked, stepping closer, closing the distance to a mere 6 feet. His finger slipped inside the trigger guard. The metallic click of the safety disengaging resonated sharply against the silence. I ignored his command. I rotated my left wrist, pulling back the cuff of my blazer. I fixed my gaze on the dial of my watch. The sweeping second hand glided across the numerals. I tracked the movement, calculating the precise response time of a tactical unit staged 2 blocks away, factoring in the elevator ascent and the corridor sprint. "What are you doing?" Roland demanded, his voice cracking. He tracked my gaze, bewildered by my absolute refusal to engage with his lethal threat. "Look at me." I did not look at him. I watched the second hand tick past the 12 o'clock position. 3, 2, 1. The heavy glass doors behind Roland buckled. A concussive, deafening crack ruptured the stagnant air. Showers of orange and white sparks erupted from the ceiling, mounted magnetic lock housings as localized breaching charges detonated. The reinforced glass shattered, transforming into thousands of harmless, pebble-sized fragments that rained across the hardwood floor. The sealed vault blew wide open. Federal agents swarmed through the shattered threshold, moving with fluid, uncompromising military precision. Heavy tactical boots thundered against the floorboards. Beams of intense white light sliced through the ambient boardroom illumination, attached to the barrels of raised, semi-automatic rifles. "Federal agents, drop the weapon!" a voice thundered, vibrating with commanding authority. Red laser sights converged, painting a clustered, glowing target directly over Roland's heart. Roland froze, his body locked into absolute stasis. He did not drop the firearm out of compliance. His neurological system simply stalled, overloaded by the sudden, overwhelming kinetic breach. He stared at the heavily armored operatives flooding his pristine boardroom, his mind incapable of bridging the gap between his perceived dominance and his immediate, total subjugation. The tactical wedge of federal agents parted slightly, creating a narrow corridor through the center of the formation. A final figure stepped over the shattered glass fragments and crossed the threshold. He did not wear tactical body armor. He wore a tailored charcoal gray suit. He moved with slow, deliberate calmness, lifting his hands to adjust his silver cufflinks as he surveyed the scene. His breathing remained steady. His posture projected unyielding, quiet dominance. Elias halted 3 feet away from Roland. He looked perfectly healthy. No burn scars marked his flesh, no trauma hindered his movement. Roland's jaw unhinged, the remaining color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, bloodless ash. He stared at Elias, his eyes wide and unblinking. The biological impossibility short-circuited his frontal lobe. He had paid mechanics to sabotage the steering column. He had reviewed the coroner's report. He had celebrated the fiery crash that reduced this exact man to charred dental records. Yet, the corpse stood in his boardroom, adjusting his sleeves. The paradox severed Roland's final tether to reality. The muscles in his hand went entirely slack. The compact firearm slipped through his fingers. The weapon plummeted, striking the mahogany table before clattering harmlessly onto the floorboards. Roland stumbled backward. The heels of his expensive leather shoes caught on the scattered documents. He collided with the edge of the conference table, his knees buckling slightly. He gasped for air, his chest heaving, his mouth hanging open in a silent, agonizing scream of paralyzing horror. He could not comprehend the physics of the moment. He could not process the resurrection occurring in front of his eyes. Elias lowered his hands, folding them neatly in front of his torso. He locked his gaze onto the trembling, shattered wealth manager. "You failed to account for the variables, Roland," Elias stated, his voice ringing with absolute, clinical finality. "Arrest him!" The federal agent surged forward, tackling the architect of my grandfather's murder to the ground. The kinetic force of the federal agents striking Roland rattled the heavy mahogany conference table. 2 operatives drove their Kevlar-shielded shoulders directly into his torso, propelling him backward. His expensive leather shoes lost traction on the scattered documents and shattered glass. He hit the hardwood floorboards with a concussive thud, expelling the oxygen from his lungs in a violent, ragged wheeze. The operatives did not afford him a single second to recover. They pinned his shoulders, driving their knees into the space between his shoulder blades. They wrenched his arms backward, forcing his wrists together. Detective Valerie Garza stepped through the breached threshold, holstering her sidearm. She moved with deliberate, unhurried authority, extracting a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from her belt. She crouched beside the gasping wealth manager. The metallic, ratcheting clicks of the restraints, locking into place, sliced through the chaos of the boardroom. "Roland Vance," Garza announced, her voice projecting a cold, mechanical cadence that left zero room for negotiation. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, interstate wire fraud, and violations of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act." She yanked him upward by the chain of the cuffs, forcing him to his knees. "We are additionally charging you with the unauthorized electronic tampering of a Class 3 medical device resulting in homicide." Across the room, Daphne's survival instincts finally fractured her paralysis. She scrambled away from the glass partition, her heels slipping wildly against the spilled water. She lunged toward the shattered doorway, prioritizing her own escape over her fiancé's subjugation. She did not reach the threshold. 2 female federal agents intercepted her flight path. They executed a flawless, tactical takedown, seizing Daphne by the shoulders and sweeping her legs. She plummeted, colliding heavily with the floor. The impact snagged the hem of her designer dress beneath the sharp edge of an overturned chair. As she thrashed against the operatives, the expensive silk tore, emitting a sharp, ripping sound that echoed across the room. The physical restraint broke her completely. Daphne shrieked, a high-pitched, hysterical wail tearing through her vocal cords. She writhed against the floorboards, her manicured nails scraping uselessly against the polished wood. "I did not do it," Daphne screamed, spit flying from her lips as the agents wrenched her arms behind her back and secured the steel cuffs. She twisted her neck, locking her manic, mascara-streaked eyes onto Garza. "He engineered the hack. He procured the fentanyl. I am a victim. Please, you have to let me go." She begged for mercy, offering up the man she planned to marry in a desperate, pathetic bid for her own salvation. Roland knelt mere feet away, his face pressed toward the floor, listening to his partner sever their alliance to save her own skin. The corrupt notary remained plastered to the carpet in the far corner, weeping silently, his hands clamped firmly over the back of his neck as an operative stood guard over him. The tactical dominance was absolute. The room belonged entirely to the federal authorities. I pushed my leather chair backward. The casters squeaked softly against the floor. I stood up, ensuring my posture remained perfectly aligned. I raised my hands, methodically smoothing the front lapels of my tailored black suit, adjusting the fabric until it sat flawlessly against my shoulders. I stepped around the mahogany table, my heels crunching over the discarded, irrevocable power of attorney documents. I stopped directly in front of Roland. He knelt on the hardwood, his chest heaving, his head bowed. Sweat saturated the collar of his bespoke shirt. He lifted his gaze, his pupils dilated with terror, staring up at the woman he spent the last 4 months hunting. I did not raise my voice. I crouched down, lowering my center of gravity until my face hovered inches from his ear. I required him to hear every single syllable of his destruction. "You believed the federal indictment represented your worst-case scenario," I whispered, the words slicing through the cacophony of Daphne's continued shrieking. "You calculated the variables of a prison sentence. You assumed you could shield your offshore liquidity, hire a premium defense attorney, and leverage your hidden capital to secure a reduced sentence." Roland swallowed hard, his throat bobbing, his eyes locked onto mine. "You failed to understand my profession, Roland," I stated, injecting absolute, freezing clarity into my tone. "I am a senior actuary for a global reinsurance firm. I evaluate catastrophic failure. My firm controls billions in liquid capital, specifically allocated to acquire and neutralize distressed assets." I watched the muscles in his jaw twitch as the financial terminology penetrated his panic. "While you monitored my house, waiting for the synthetic fentanyl to stop my heart, I mapped the debt structure of your Cayman Islands holding company," I explained, dissecting his empire with surgical precision. "You borrowed heavily from unregulated lenders to float a massive commercial real estate venture. You leveraged your entire portfolio against a balloon payment defaulting tomorrow morning. You cannot access those files," Roland stammered, his voice a broken, hollow rasp. "The encryption—" "Elias shattered your encryption 3 days ago," I corrected, motioning subtly toward my husband standing quietly by the door. "I packaged your toxic debt into a comprehensive risk assessment portfolio. I presented the data to my firm's executive board yesterday afternoon. I proved your offshore syndicate represented a vastly undervalued distressed asset, provided the primary debtor was neutralized." Roland's breath hitched. The blood drained entirely from his lips. "My firm authorized a hostile acquisition," I revealed, delivering the final, lethal variable. "We purchased your debt from the cartel affiliates at a fraction of the cost. We utilized institutional capital to buy the paper. We own the loans." "Roland," he stared at me, his neurological system short-circuiting as the magnitude of the financial maneuver crashed over him. "You no longer owe the cartel," I whispered, ensuring the reality anchored deep inside his cortex. "You owe me, And because you utilize stolen funds to secure the initial collateral, you are in immediate breach of the loan covenants. I stood up. Towering over his kneeling form, I looked down at the shattered architect of my grandfather's demise. I initiated immediate foreclosure procedures at 8 o'clock this morning, I announced, my voice ringing with clinical, unyielding finality. My corporate attorneys seized the offshore parcels. They froze your holding accounts. They liquidated your domestic real estate to cover the margins. I paused, letting the silence stretch between us, allowing the mathematics of his ruin to solidify. You are not merely facing decades in a federal penitentiary, I concluded. I systematically stripped you of every single asset, property, and offshore account you possess. You hold zero equity. You maintain zero leverage. You are completely, irreversibly bankrupt. You do not even own the suit on your back. The psychological infrastructure sustaining Roland's ego completely collapsed. The illusion of his superiority, the arrogance that fueled his predatory actions, incinerated under the blinding light of total financial annihilation. His chest contracted violently. A high-pitched, guttural sob ripped through his vocal cords. He collapsed forward, his forehead striking the polished hardwood floor. He curled his knees toward his chest, weeping uncontrollably, his tears mixing with the sweat and spilled water soaking into the floorboards. He sobbed for his lost wealth, mourning his stolen millions with a ferocity he never once displayed for the human lives he extinguished. I did not offer him a fraction of a second of pity. I did not revel in his tears. I experienced a profound clinical detachment. The liability was successfully liquidated. The threat was permanently neutralized. I turned my back on the sobbing wealth manager. I walked across the shattered glass, passing Daphne, who remained pinned to the floor by the federal operatives, her shrieks devolving into pathetic, exhausted whimpers. I did not spare my sister a single glance. She ceased to exist the moment she authorized the pacemaker override. I approached the breached doorway. Elias waited in the corridor, the fluorescent lights catching the sharp angles of his jaw. He extended his right hand. I reached out, interlocking my fingers firmly with his. His grip felt solid, anchoring and entirely alive. We walked away from the 14th floor boardroom, moving in perfect, synchronized tandem. We navigated the quiet corridor, stepping into the waiting elevator, and left the parasites to be dragged away in chains. Their fake aristocratic empire burned entirely to the ground. 4 months passed. The heavy brass handles of the federal courthouse doors yielded to my push, opening into a marble atrium packed wall-to-wall with reporters, camera crews, and buzzing spectators. The media devoured the scandal. The narrative of an elite wealth manager and a socialite heiress executing a digital assassination for a $12 million trust generated relentless, sensational coverage. Camera shutters fired in a continuous, staccato rhythm as we bypassed the security barricades. I ignored the shouted questions, keeping my gaze locked straight ahead. I navigated the polished corridors, flanked by Elias on my right and Silas Thorne on my left. We stepped into the gallery of courtroom 4. The ambient noise of the hallway vanished, severed by the heavy oak doors closing behind us. The room smelled of polished wood and stale circulated air. I took my seat in the direct center of the front row, smoothing the fabric of my tailored gray suit. Elias sat beside me, resting his forearm against the wooden divider. We anchored the room, waiting in silence to watch the cold mathematics of justice execute its final equation. The trial did not resemble a legal battle. It operated as a unilateral slaughter. The federal prosecutor, a veteran litigator possessing a razor-sharp cadence, did not rely on emotional manipulation to sway the jury. He built an impenetrable fortress of digital concrete. Detective Valerie Garza took the witness stand on the second day. She wore a structured blazer, projecting absolute, unyielding authority. She authenticated the audio files extracted from the 14th floor boardroom. The prosecutor activated the playback. Daphne's shrill, hysterical confession vibrated through the high-fidelity courtroom speakers, bouncing off the oak paneling. The 12 jurors listened in absolute silence as my sister shrieked her guilt into the record. They heard her boast about swapping my medication. They heard Roland scream, attempting to silence her through physical violence. The acoustic evidence dismantled the presumption of innocence in less than 5 minutes. The prosecution transitioned to the forensic data. They projected the pacemaker telemetry logs onto a massive digital display erected beside the jury box. The hexadecimal code glowed starkly against the white screen. An expert witness, a cardiac electrophysiologist, took the stand to translate the raw data. He utilized a laser pointer. Isolating the precise millisecond the localized frequency spike overrode Thaddeus's ventricular rhythm. He detailed the mechanics of the hack, explaining how the unauthorized command flooded the device, inducing a fatal, irreversible cardiac arrest. The jury stared at the illuminated screen, their expressions hardening into stone. They digested the reality of a remote, digital execution. The prosecution did not merely prove that a murder occurred, they mapped the exact sequence of keystrokes that stopped my grandfather's heart. Stripped of their stolen wealth and subjected to immediate asset freezes, Roland and Daphne relied on court-appointed defense attorneys, deprived of the premium legal shielding they expected to purchase. Their defense strategy collapsed entirely. Facing a mountain of irrefutable evidence, they abandoned any remaining pretense of solidarity. The illusion of their aristocratic partnership fractured, exposing the parasitic, self-serving core of their bond. Roland took the witness stand in a desperate bid to salvage his freedom. The 4 months in the county holding facility had physically deteriorated him. He no longer wore bespoke, tailored suits. He wore a standard issue, beige dress shirt that hung loosely off his newly gaunt frame. The arrogant, predatory wealth manager evaporated, replaced by a cornered, sweating coward. He gripped the edges of the witness box, his knuckles turning white. He leveled his index finger directly at Daphne. He testified that she masterminded the pacemaker override, claiming she manipulated his access to the medical records to secure her inheritance. He painted himself as a coerced financial advisor, trapped by a sociopathic fiancé who threatened to destroy his career if he refused to facilitate her grandfather's murder. Daphne retaliated with feral, unrestrained desperation. She demanded to testify the following morning. She walked to the stand, her designer wardrobe replaced by a faded, generic navy blouse. Her blonde hair hung flat, entirely stripped of its expensive salon styling. The polished socialite facade lay in ruins. She produced manufactured tears, weeping into a tissue as she accused Roland of domestic coercion. She explicitly detailed his collapsing offshore syndicates and his massive cartel debts. She told the jury he threatened to kill her if she refused to lace my capsules with the synthetic fentanyl. She claimed she deliberately botched the poisoning attempt to save my life, spinning a web of transparent, contradictory lies. They tore each other apart in the open court. They shredded their respective characters, volunteering intimate details of their financial crimes and moral bankruptcies in frantic, pathetic bids for leniency. The federal prosecutor remained entirely unmoved by their mutual destruction. He denied all requests for plea agreements. He offered 0 concessions. During his closing arguments, he stood before the jury box and presented a binary equation: hold these 2 individuals accountable for conspiracy, interstate wire fraud, and premeditated murder, or allow predators to walk free. The judge handed the case to the jury. We vacated the courtroom, anticipating a prolonged deliberation. We purchased black coffee from the cafeteria on the ground floor. We did not finish our cups. The bailiff summoned us back upstairs before the liquid turned cold. The jury reached a consensus in less than 2 hours. They required only 110 minutes to process the data, evaluate the betrayals, and return a verdict. They did not struggle with the decision. The mathematics of the evidence provided only one logical conclusion. We stood as the jury foreperson. A stern woman in her 50s delivered the decision. Guilty on the charges of interstate wire fraud, guilty on the charges of racketeering, guilty on the charges of conspiracy to commit murder, guilty on the charges of first-degree homicide. The words struck the silent courtroom like a hammer striking an anvil. The judge did not delay the sentencing phase. She adjusted her reading glasses. Staring down from the elevated mahogany bench, She did not offer a lengthy lecture on morality. She delivered the penalty with brutal, unyielding clarity. She looked at Roland, citing his breach of fiduciary duty and his calculated execution of a vulnerable client. She sentenced him to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. She turned her gaze to Daphne. She cited her profound greed, her absolute lack of remorse, and her willing participation in the assassination of her own bloodline. She repeated the exact same mandate life in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. Roland collapsed into his chair. He buried his face in his trembling hands, gasping for air, his chest heaving as he mourned his permanently extinguished freedom. The federal marshals stepped forward immediately. They gripped his biceps. Hauling his dead weight to his feet, they fastened heavy chains around his waist, securing his wrists to the iron links. Daphne did not collapse. The bailiffs approached her, securing the steel cuffs around her wrists. As they turned her toward the side exit leading to the holding cells, her momentum stalled. She rotated her neck, scanning the gallery. Her eyes found mine. The venomous, entitled spark she carried for 34 years was completely extinguished. Her eyes looked hollow, vacant, and utterly dark. She faced decades locked inside a 6x9 concrete cell. She was entirely stripped of the $12 million, the designer clothes, the luxury vehicles, and the fabricated aristocratic status she had murdered to obtain. She possessed nothing. I held her gaze. I did not flinch. I did not offer her a single fraction of a second of pity. I blinked, severing the visual connection, and turned my back on her. I walked up the center aisle of the courtroom, matching my stride with Elias. Silas followed closely behind, shielding our flank. We pushed through the heavy oak doors, bypassed the shouting press corps in the atrium, and stepped out onto the granite steps of the courthouse. I inhaled deeply, pulling the crisp, freezing morning air into my lungs. I exhaled a long breath, watching the vapor dissipate into the sky, finally, absolutely free from the toxic bloodline that had tried to bury me. The probate courts operate with agonizing, bureaucratic lethargy, but the federal conviction shattered the administrative blockades. Exactly 14 days after the judge slammed her wooden gavel against the sounding block, the digital transfer initiated. I sat at my home terminal, monitoring the encrypted financial ledger, the routing numbers verified, the authentication protocols cleared, $12 million deposited directly into a newly established, ironclad trust under my exclusive, unyielding control. Thaddeus's legacy officially bypassed the parasites and landed securely in my hands. I refused to hoard the capital. I weaponized it. The following Monday, I drove to the towering glass skyscraper housing my global reinsurance firm. I did not log into my workstation. I bypassed my cubicle and walked directly into the mahogany-paneled executive suite. I placed a single, typed resignation letter on the managing partner's desk. I severed my ties with the corporate grind instantly. I no longer required a laminated corporate badge to validate my actuarial expertise. I possessed the independent funding to dictate my own parameters, construct my own algorithms, and choose my own targets. Elias and I systematically dismantled our life in the suburbs. We abandoned the compromised house. We packed our essential belongings, hired a crew to liquidate the remaining furniture, and handed the keys to a broker. We required an environment we controlled absolutely. We needed a fortress. We acquired 200 acres of dense, old-growth pine forest located 3 hours north of the city limits. We purchased a sprawling, brutalist estate constructed from sheer granite and reinforced glass, anchored directly into the side of a jagged cliff. The architecture projected impenetrable strength. Silas Thorne relocated to a renovated gatehouse positioned at the base of the mountain road, officially assuming the title of our logistics and security director. Silas did not install standard commercial alarms. He militarized our perimeter. He entrenched seismic pressure sensors beneath the gravel access roads, capable of differentiating between wildlife and vehicular approach. He mounted thermal imaging cameras high in the tree canopy, overlapping their fields of view to eliminate any visual dead zones. Elias spent 3 weeks wiring a closed loop, localized server network. He severed our internal mainframes from the external internet entirely, ensuring our data remained impervious to remote digital breaches. We engineered an impregnable sanctuary, permanently neutralizing the residual hypervigilance Roland had forced upon our daily routines. We refused to let the trauma of the past 4 months calcify into fear. We forged it into a highly lethal, offensive weapon. The digital assassination of my grandfather exposed a glaring, systemic vulnerability within the financial sector. Predators operating under the guise of fiduciary duty routinely exploited the elderly, draining estates while hiding behind complex legal jargon and offshore routing codes. We established an independent investigative risk assessment firm to hunt them. We rejected corporate contracts. We exclusively audited vulnerable estates. We required an operational commander with law enforcement authority. We recruited Detective Valerie Garza, disgusted by the bureaucratic lethargy and political corruption rotting her local precinct. Garza surrendered her badge. She accepted a lucrative position as our director of investigations. We formed an apex trinity. Garza provided the tactical law enforcement framework and interrogation leverage. Elias supplied the forensic data extraction, penetrating encrypted ledgers and bypassing digital firewalls. I executed the actuarial risk modeling, isolating the financial anomalies and calculating the exact trajectory of the stolen capital. We operated without the restrictive constraints of jurisdictional red tape. Our inaugural operation established our reputation. A wealthy, 80-year-old widow's portfolio exhibited erratic, massive liquidations. Her retained estate attorney claimed market volatility caused the deficit. Elias bypassed the attorney's corporate firewalls in less than 2 hours. I mapped the unauthorized capital hemorrhages, tracing the diverted funds through a labyrinth of shell companies into a private bank account in the Bahamas. Garza constructed an impenetrable evidence packet, complete with time-stamped wire transfers and forged signature logs. We did not confront the attorney with a civil lawsuit. We handed the unredacted dossiers directly to federal prosecutors, bypassing the corrupt local authorities entirely. We orchestrated a federal raid on his law firm. We ripped the stolen capital from his offshore accounts, returning the assets to the rightful heir, and watched him dragged out of his lobby in steel handcuffs. We became the exact nightmare Roland had faced in his final hours. Silas managed our logistical supply lines. He orchestrated our encrypted communications, secured our physical movements when we engaged hostile targets, and conducted relentless penetration testing on our own security grids. The firm operated with mechanical, ruthless efficiency. We became an apex predator in the financial ecosystem, hunting the hunters. 6 months after the trial concluded, I stood on the slate balcony of our master's suite. The evening temperature dropped, leaving a crisp, biting chill in the air. I held a crystal glass filled with a deep, full-bodied red wine. I rested my forearms against the heavy wrought iron railing, gazing out over the expansive territory we owned and protected. The setting sun bled across the horizon, igniting the rugged tree line in brilliant, fiery shades of amber and violent violet. The wind rustled the heavy pine branches, delivering the sharp, grounding scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Footsteps echoed softly against the hardwood floor of the bedroom behind me. Elias stepped through the sliding glass doors, transitioning from the warmth of the suite into the crisp evening air. He closed the distance between us, his movements smooth and silent. He wrapped his arm securely around my waist, pulling my back flush against his chest. He rested his chin gently on my shoulder, his breathing synchronizing perfectly with mine. I leaned back into his embrace, taking a slow sip of the wine. The liquid warmed my throat, anchoring me to the present moment. We stood in silence, surveying the fortress we had built. We had walked through a crucible of literal and metaphorical fire. We stared down a cartel-backed assassination plot. We dismantled a ruthless, parasitic criminal syndicate from the inside out. We dragged the murderers of my bloodline into the blinding, unforgiving light of a federal courtroom and forced them to answer for their greed. We emerged from the wreckage entirely whole. We possessed our freedom, our uncompromised marriage, and the $12 million my grandfather explicitly intended for me to wield. Miles away, trapped inside a monolithic concrete superstructure, Roland and Daphne sat in isolated 6x9 cells. The federal penitentiary dictated every single second of their existence. They wore generic, state-issued jumpsuits. They ate strictly regulated meals. They stared at reinforced steel bars. The suffocating, inescapable reality of their total annihilation constituted their permanent, unchanging environment. They possessed decades to sit in the sterile silence and calculate the precise mathematics of their catastrophic failure. They plotted to murder an actuary. They evaluated my quiet disposition and mistakenly calculated compliance. They believed they could hunt us, steal our legacy, and dance on our graves without consequence. Instead, they engineered their own spectacular destruction by severely, fatally underestimating the wrong woman. We retreated from the slate balcony, sliding the heavy glass doors shut against the biting mountain wind. The ambient warmth of the study enveloped us, smelling faintly of seasoned firewood and old paper. We approached the massive oak table dominating the center of the room. Its surface sat buried beneath meticulously organized stacks of physical dossiers, encrypted digital tablets, and printed financial ledgers. I pulled out a leather chair, taking my seat beside Elias. We spent the remainder of the evening doing exactly what Roland feared most. We hunted. We reviewed case files for our newly established foundation, utilizing the exact same forensic precision that saved our lives to protect others. We cross-referenced erratic withdrawals from a dementia patient's estate against a corrupt conservator's offshore routing nodes. The $12 million trust fund that Daphne and Roland had killed for was now actively funding the systemic imprisonment of predators exactly like them. It was the ultimate, poetic justice. The harrowing journey of surviving a betrayal by your own blood illuminates a profound and unshakable truth. True power is never loud, and it certainly cannot be stolen. When narcissistic predators attempt to trample your boundaries, they rely entirely on the assumption that your silence equates to weakness. They mistake your quiet endurance for compliance. However, authentic strength lies in the cold, rational calculation of your own worth. You do not have to scream to prove your power. By utilizing your intellect, setting impenetrable boundaries, and refusing to absorb the toxicity of those who seek to exploit you, you transform yourself from a victim into an absolute force of nature. Never shrink yourself to appease the egos of arrogant parasites. I reached for a thick, manila folder resting at the apex of the stack. I opened the cover, breaking the seal on a new financial anomaly. The target was a state-appointed guardian orchestrating a systematic liquidation of his elderly ward's retirement accounts. I ran my index finger down the printed ledger, isolating a recurring, localized frequency of shell company transfers. My actuarial training categorized the variables instantly. I mapped the capital hemorrhage, tracking the stolen assets across state lines and into a shadow corporation registered in a low-regulation jurisdiction. I did not feel the paralyzing weight of grief or the suffocating hypervigilance that plagued my existence 4 months prior. I felt an absolute predatory focus. Elias leaned over my shoulder, his eyes tracking the numerical progression on the page. He typed a rapid sequence of commands into his encrypted terminal, launching a localized intrusion protocol. Lines of green code cascaded across the black monitor, bypassing the Guardian's rudimentary digital firewalls in a matter of seconds. Elias extracted the target's internal communications, isolating a chain of emails detailing the fraudulent property transfers. He did not celebrate. He operated with the mechanical, ruthless efficiency that engineered his own resurrection. He compiled the digital footprints, packaging the incriminatory data into a compressed, heavily encrypted file. I picked up my secure mobile device and dialed Detective Valerie Garza. The line connected instantly. I did not offer polite greetings. I recited the target's coordinates and the precise valuation of the stolen assets. Garza confirmed receipt of the data packet, her voice resonating with grim satisfaction. She initiated the federal warrants, bypassing local jurisdictions to ensure the target could not leverage political connections to escape prosecution. Within 48 hours, federal agents would breach the Guardian's office, freezing his accounts and securing the stolen capital. We operated as a silent, lethal machine, striking from the shadows of the pine forest, permanently neutralizing threats before they could inflict terminal damage. The contrast between our current reality and the fate of our enemies provided a constant, grounding equilibrium. I closed the manila folder, aligning the edges of the paper with methodical precision. I pictured Daphne, stripped of her tailored cashmere and designer handbags, sitting on a thin mattress inside a federal penitentiary. She wore a generic, state-issued uniform. She adhered to a rigid, uncompromising schedule dictated by armed guards. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, illuminating a 6x9 concrete box that represented her entire universe for the next several decades. She traded her freedom, her family, and her future for a desperate grasp at unearned wealth, only to end up with absolutely nothing. I pictured Roland, stripped of his bespoke suits and his predatory arrogance. He occupied a maximum security cell, entirely isolated from the offshore syndicates he sought to appease. The cartel creditors he feared no longer hunted him. They recognized his total bankruptcy and abandoned him to the federal justice system. He possessed zero equity. He maintained zero leverage. He existed as a numbered inmate, a disgraced wealth manager, broken by the very systemic architecture he attempted to exploit. He tried to architect a digital execution, and instead, he engineered his own permanent, inescapable obsolescence. Thaddeus's legacy survived the assault. My grandfather built his wealth through decades of calculated, meticulous labor. He recognized the parasitic void inside my sister, and he structured his trust to protect his life's work. I honored his final directive. I did not allow his capital to fund vanity projects or luxury excess. I forged his $12 million into an impenetrable shield for the vulnerable. We defended the estates of those who could not fight back. We dismantled the networks of those who preyed upon the weak. We transformed a tragedy into an active, ongoing crusade for financial justice. Elias closed his terminal, the screen going black. He reached across the oak table, his fingers interlocking with mine. His grip felt solid, anchoring, and entirely real. We survived a targeted assassination. We navigated a labyrinth of deception, betrayal, and lethal ambition. We did not merely escape the fire. We harnessed the flames. We forged an unbreakable partnership, cemented by the absolute certainty that we could face the darkest, most treacherous elements of human nature and emerge victorious. We built an empire on a foundation of unyielding truth, and no predator would ever breach our walls again. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to silently dismantle a toxic situation to reclaim your peace? Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, and always remember your true worth. Goodbye.